Today I bring you a brand new story. It's just another normal day in Korea, people walking around, minding their business. And that guy in the middle, no doubt, that's our protagonist. Looking closely, he's actually kinda handsome. But seriously, if he keeps using his phone like that, his neck is gonna turn into a boomerang. He was so distracted that he walked straight into someone. The guy cursed him out, totally deserved. And our hero apologized like a good boy. This is the sad, uneventful life of our dude. But while he was mentally complaining about how boring everything is, a loud, ridiculous noise shook the area and made everyone stop in their tracks. Before they could even figure out what was happening, boom, a second explosion. A giant yellow lightning bolt hit the ground just a few steps away and deep-fried a bunch of people. Everyone froze in absolute fear. The blast sent cars flying like paper planes. And then, because things weren't bad enough, more lightning bolts started falling. But these weren't your regular lightning strikes. No, these things were basically mini meteors. People ran like their lives depended on it. Spoiler, they did. What started as a weird event turned into an all-out lightning apocalypse across the entire city. Just imagine the destruction of one lightning bolt. Now multiply that by 10,000. Our poor protagonist was just one of the thousands sprinting for dear life. A girl near him was also trying to escape, and he saw a chance to finally be useful in life. He yelled for her to follow him to safety, but turns out she had more luck. An ambulance came by and stopped to help her. Now she didn't have to run for her life anymore. Actually, she didn't have to run at all, ever again. Our guy went back to running, crying partly from the trauma and partly because that was straight up terrifying. But fate wasn't done messing with him yet. Because right ahead, a huge truck was ready to isekai him into another dimension. And just before it could turn him into protagonist paste, something wild happened. A white flash blinded him, and he got sucked into a portal. A lightning bolt, just like the ones from before, crashed down in a totally different place where it was night. We don't know how much time passed, but we do know one thing. He survived. He woke up groggy and confused, still traumatized by Truck Kun. But his attention quickly shifted to something new. Where the hell is he? He looked up and saw something insane. The birds in the sky looked like monsters straight out of a horror game, and there were 2 moons. That definitely wasn't part of the Korea he remembered. That realization hit him harder than the lightning back in the city. And to make things worse, he was freezing. And not just hands and feet, I mean freezing everywhere. One thing's clear. This place, this is not Earth. Looking up, he becomes confused as there are several monsters surrounding the area. Confused, he asks himself what is going on, and moreover, why he has no clothes on. Shortly after, the young man stands up, seeming surprised by something, as he finds himself face to face with a giant bear. However, within seconds, he is attacked by a pack of wolves. Then the scene cuts to a doctor analyzing some data, saying that when he woke up, he was on a planet with 2 moons and a forest full of monsters, wondering how he managed to come back alive from such a place. However, the young man seemed to be apprehensive about something. A flashback of that bear being defeated appears. Then the wolves begin to devour the bear. The protagonist, watching it all, is desperate. Meanwhile, a white wolf is behind him. The boy suddenly notices the creature behind him. As a result, he starts running non-stop. To survive, he gave it everything he had. At that moment, a system informs him that his constitution has increased to level 1. Seeing all of this, the protagonist is confused, but he trips over a rock, starting to tumble downhill, falling off a cliff. However, the boy manages to grab onto some bushes, successfully staying alive, wondering what that sound from earlier had been. Looking around, he is surprised as he finds a kind of fruit in front of him, mentioning that he is very hungry and wondering if they are edible. But when he looks to the side, he notices some ants eating those fruits. So, without any remorse, he starts eating them. But at the same moment, he hears a noise in the bushes, and a creature with a piercing gaze is him. Then, a giant snake lunges at the boy, but within seconds, it is devoured by a giant frog. The young man watching all of this still cannot believe what he is seeing. That place is completely insane. But in reality, maybe he is the one who has gone mad. Time passes, and it has now been 67 days since he arrived in that place. Moreover, that pack of wolves from earlier has been following him and still hasn't given up. That's why the boy fears they might catch him off guard at any moment. Additionally, the forest has things far more dangerous than wolves, so he needs to find a safe place. Once again, time passes, and it has now been a year since he has been in that place. Looking up, the protagonist finds a giant banana, so he begins grabbing the big banana. The system alerts him that his strength has increased to level 1, and you can already see that the boy is quite ripped. As a consequence of everything happening around him, the protagonist has been forced to adapt. However, a wolf pup keeps insisting on chasing him at all costs. That's why he got so used to it that he even missed it when it wasn't around. Meanwhile, something seemed to be falling on the boy's back. Looking up, he notices something. His expression quickly changes because he had encountered a giant gorilla charging directly at him. However, the young man manages to dodge the attack, breaking the branch he was holding onto, saying he should have better luck next time. As a result, the gorilla falls to the ground, but it was heading towards that wolf and ends up hitting it. Meanwhile, the protagonist was watching everything. Soon after, the gorilla gets back up, looking at the wolf that was apparently injured, beginning to charge at it. However, the protagonist was already advancing towards the gorilla, landing an attack on its eye, but that still wasn't enough. So, the gorilla throws the boy, he collides with a tree. Quickly, the monster charges at him again. Irritated, the young man says that was a very stupid move on his part. The scene then cuts to the doctor, asking if the protagonist had really done all of that. The boy replies that he couldn't keep running away from territorial fights, and that wouldn't solve anything, because no matter where he went, there would always be a ruler. Returning to the scene, the protagonist was about to be attacked by the gorilla. However, the wolf ends up appearing to protect the young man. The boy becomes unconscious while the pack attacks the gorilla. He truly thought it was his end, but the wolves didn't attack him while he was unconscious, because they must have thought he saved the cub earlier, and that little one was the son of the Wolf King, leader of the Crimson Wolves. Time passes after that event, and those wolves were running towards that location. Alongside them, the protagonist, together with the wolves, was also running. Looking to the side, he notices that his friend was tired, so he picks him up and starts carrying him. Once again, time passes, and it's been 2 years since the boy had been there. That's why it seemed like they had accepted him into the pack. 3 years had passed since the young man was stranded, and he seemed to be developing his climbing skills. However, he was still in a forest, and in fact, he still hadn't managed to escape that place. Moreover, he hadn't found any civilization. Thus, he had become a member of the wolf family and continued participating in territorial battles for the survival of his family. Once again, time passes, and it's been 120 years since he was stranded. That's why he thought he was the only human on that planet. In a constant battle for survival, he ended up making more friends, but even so, he lost some companions. Wondering how long he had been stranded, because he had forgotten the date, and it seemed like hundreds of years had passed, wondering how he was still alive. The doctor then asks if, after becoming the king of the wolves, even after 500 years, he still hadn't found any civilization. That's why they wanted to know how he had managed to return to planet Earth. The boy replies that he had started a war against the gorilla race for the lunar hill. Thus, a giant battle broke out, and a protagonist was also in the middle of it, charging at one of the gorillas. However, something strange happens as he was teleported once again, and when he opens his eyes, he is in a different place. Meanwhile, a girl seems to be analyzing a radio, mentioning that something was very strange as the dimensional energy was off the charts. The other guy then asks her to send the coordinates to the portal control team, so the girl does as he requested. At that moment, a portal begins to open. Thus, everyone starts fleeing the area, and an explosion occurs, and that collision causes everyone to fall to the ground. Surprised because a portal had really opened, the other guy, desperate, says he doesn't want to die, and the other girl is already prepared for an attack, saying she will buy time so they should flee. The other guy then asks headquarters to send emergency reinforcements to that location. At that moment, the portal was in front of the girl. She then tells the person to get out of there as she was going to cut them to pieces. At that moment, a man's silhouette appears from the portal, leaving the girl completely shocked by what she saw, and as a result, she becomes paralyzed. At that moment, the man begins to scream, then he comes out of the portal. At that moment, the girl approaches the protagonist, and the other guy is surprised because it really was another person. The girl wonders what that force from earlier was all about, because it was a pressure she had never felt before, not even against monsters in high-level dungeons. She wondered what the protagonist was. Thus, the situation was resolved, and that boy was a returnee, so they should call the ambulance right away. Then the scene cuts again to the professor. He thanks the boy for everything. His testimony and medical examination would be shared with the awakened central office. For that reason, he seemed quite healthy and should be discharged in a few days. Shortly after, the boy calls the doctor again, saying it was the first time he had spoken to a civilized being in 1,000 years, so he thanks him for listening to his story. The doctor informs him that he had shared a very valuable story, thus it should be the ones thanking him. Then he leaves the room. While walking, he thinks that the boy was a very interesting patient, and his story was vividly detailed, which would have made him a great novelist. Then the scene cuts to the awakened central office, and that girl asks if they were sure the information was correct because it didn't seem right. The guy then questions what was wrong with it. The girl responds that the card said he was an F rank. The The man explains that he was a rare F-rank patient, and it was a shame because if he had been E-rank, he would have received a government disability benefit. The girl, looking at the protagonist's card, says that if he was an F-rank, it meant he was an ordinary person, wondering how he managed to pass through a portal and if they were sure it wasn't a mistake. The guy responds that he was lucky and slipped through, and by chance he found the returned stone, mentioning that he had just received the doctor's report asking if she wanted to read it. So the girl starts reading that information, as it was a common disorder among F-rank returnees. Moreover, he was behaving as if he were a wolf. Remembering the protagonist's expression, the girl wonders if it had been her imagination, asking if that was the documentation for the returnee named Park. The man confirms that it was saying that even though he was an F-rank, they still needed to treat a returnee accordingly. So the girl asks to deliver it to him personally. However, the man wants to know why. She responds that she needed to check with her own eyes. 2 weeks had passed since he returned to Earth after spending 1,000 years in another world. He wanted to go back at any moment, but since he had returned, everything seemed very strange. For that reason, he didn't know how he should live from that day forward. Shortly after, a girl appears, mentioning that it's time for his meal. She then hands him his food, and the boy apparently was hungry, so he should eat right away. Shortly after, that other girl appears, observing the protagonist eating in a different way. Then Park notices that the girl is beside him. It is revealed that her name is Choi, and she is from the Awakened Central Office. Standing up, Park says that the scent was of a blonde person. For that reason, it seemed very familiar. Porter responds that she was the first person he had met when he returned, thinking that he definitely resembled a predator when he came out of the portal. However, perhaps there was something wrong with his sensory ability. Finishing his meal, Park says it was very tasty, asking what the Awakened Central Office was about. Then the girl asks why he was speaking so informally with her. Park replies that he was over 1,000 years old, and the girl didn't seem to believe him, saying that the Awakened Central Office was an organization designed to help returnees adjust to society. Therefore, those were the pieces of information that returnees needed to know. He could take as much time as he needed to read them. For now, he should just sigh and agree to share his information. Shortly after, Park takes the pen, saying it had been a long time since he had seen that object. Even so, after 1,000 years since he returned, they were still using that kind of tool. Shortly after, Park signs the paper. Observing the protagonist, Choi wonders if he was nothing more than an idiot. Right after, she calls the boy again. Yanana asks what she wanted. Choi asks if he had learned how to draw in that place. The protagonist replies that he already knew how to draw before. Choi asks if he had learned anything different, like magic or martial arts. Park replies no, as he had lived in a forest. To survive, he had to do many things. The girl then comments that, in order to survive, he spent 10 years running everywhere, and that to become a true returnee capable of crossing portals, it's necessary to kill monsters and steal their dimensional energy. However, she mentions that despite surviving in such a dangerous dimension, he only managed to cross the portal and find the return stone by pure luck. Park responds that he wasn't there for 10 years, but for 1,000 years. Choi, irritated, says it wasn't 1,000 years, but only 10, and that he was mistaken. Choi asks him to check his information, which indicates that he disappeared in 2015 and returned in 2025 through a portal. Looking at the data, the boy is surprised, realizing it was true. The girl then hands him his awakened identification again. As she walks away, Choi mentions that part of his expenses would be deducted due to the damage he caused, and that he should inquire about it. She also recommends that once he's recovered, he should go straight back to his family. Shortly after, Choi says goodbye and leaves. Park, for his part, is thoughtful about the girl's words. He wonders if his family would still be alive. In the past, he had given up on everything, assuming that even if he returned to Earth, his friends and family would already be dead. Now that he had returned, he had to deal with the fact that he had lost the forest family that had been with him for 1,000 years. However, that was only an assumption, as only 10 years had passed. Upon examining the documents, Park is shocked. He discovers that his parents had indeed died on that day. However, not everything was lost, as Juno, his younger brother, was still alive. Desperate, Park quickly tries to leave the hospital and rushes back to the doctor. The doctor asks if there is a problem, and Park replies that he needs his help because his brother is still alive and he wants to know if the doctor could find him. The doctor, hesitant, says he doesn't believe Park is ready to return to society and that he would need to check the situation first. Park, impatient, responds that the doctor hadn't understood the seriousness of the situation, as he wasn't there to ask for permission. At that moment, the doctor makes a gesture indicating something. He then mentions that there was a condition. Shortly after, the boy is already in a car, thanking the doctor and promising not to forget the favor. The doctor responds that they will stay in touch. Before leaving, he asks the driver to ensure Park arrives safely, as he still wasn't fully recovered. As the car drives away, the girl comments that the doctor paid all of Park's hospital expenses, as well as providing clothes and even the driver. She asks why he did all of that for Park, considering that returnees of rank X are usually neglected by the central office. The doctor replies that he wanted to keep hearing that man's story, and besides, he needed to fix the doorknob as soon as possible. The girl, surprised, remembers how the doorknob was damaged, recalling the moment when Park opened the door in a hurry. Later, the doctor is in his office, reflecting that it was the second time the doorknob had been broken. He comments that it had been a long time since he had smelled an irregular. Meanwhile, Park is still in the taxi. A news report comes on informing that at 3:00 p.m. that day, monsters had escaped in an unprotected field in the province. The error occurred due to a miscalculation in the breaking little portal. The monsters were surrounding the area. The situation was expected to be resolved in approximately 50 minutes. 2 attacks were neutralized, but 12 awakened soldiers had died. As he listens to the news, Park watches closely. A flashback of the doctor appears, where he mentions that the world had changed drastically, becoming a completely different place after the great disaster. The doctor comments that if he were awakened, he would have quit his mediocre job and become rich by hunting in the fields. The protagonist then asks what that was. The man responds that Park must have hit his head hard, not to even know that. Park, in turn, asks him to just explain it already. 10 years ago, a door opened to the entire world. That's why that day is called the Great Disaster. It was the first dimensional convergence of their world, which connected with several others and was invaded by monsters. On that day, 10% of the world's population was lost. The military at the time wasn't enough to stop the monsters that appeared everywhere. So in regions where military strength was weak, mercenaries were sent. People who disappeared during the disaster, or the so-called awakened, received mercenary licenses and permission to hunt monsters. Park then asks how he could become a mercenary. The man bursts out laughing, saying it's difficult for an ordinary person, because first, you need to awaken. After that, you just need to pass the mercenary test at the awakened central office. The boy comments that it sounded pretty complicated. Time passes, and the boy seems to be heading somewhere. The driver informs him that they have arrived. He asks if Park can see the house in front, as that was the indicated address. Shortly after, the protagonist steps out of the car, thanking him for everything. Meanwhile, the young man walks toward the house. An elderly woman observes him from above and asks who he is. He responds that he is there for Cherno. The woman stays silent and comments that he still wears diapers, but talks as if he were an adult. Park, however, doesn't understand what she means. She responds that no one by that name lives there and asks him to leave. The boy wonders if he had come to the wrong place. However, inside the house, he hears some people arguing. Shortly after, he approaches the door. He picks up a piece of paper nearby, wondering if his brother was in debt. Sometime later, the boy is walking down the street, thinking that in the jungle, the law of the strongest prevails. But in civilized society, money is the true power. The scene then cuts to a building. Park enters and presents his awakened card. The woman informs him that his application for the mercenary test was denied because he didn't meet the requirements. Park asks what was wrong since he's an F rank awakened. The woman replies that he was classified as F rank, 4 points below the necessary level. The boy asks how that's possible, as he had crossed a portal 2 weeks ago. The woman explains that ordinary people die when they try to cross a portal, their bodies split in half. She continues, saying she doesn't believe he really did it. Either way, he could attend the awakened school or earn points in field battles, and should return when he becomes a true awakened. Leaving the place, Park thinks that the system is very confusing. However, he becomes curious about the goblin field in Suwon. The scene cuts to another location. Inside a taxi, Park asks how far those walls stretch. The driver replies that they surround the entire city, and then he can see it on the map app. He asks if Park has a download of the app, as the city is divided into 12 areas with hundreds of gates for transit between them. Park, observing the situation, decides he needs to immediately. Shortly after, he spots his destination, and the taxi informs him they've arrived at Suwon Field, Gate 27. The boy gets out of the car and faces a giant area. He assumes that crossing that gate would lead to a hunting ground. Shortly after, he begins walking toward the location. 2 soldiers stand motionless at the site. They ask what the protagonist is doing there. He replies that he's there to hunt. One of the soldiers remains silent and asks to see his mercenary license. However, Park responds that he doesn't have one. The soldier says that ordinary civilians are prohibited from entering that area. They then notice something nearby. The other soldier requests they close the exit, but it's too late. A car appears, crashing through the site. Inside the car, a creature devours a man. As a result, the car collides with a wall. Meanwhile, the other soldier calls for the emergency squad to contain the creature. The soldiers surround the vehicle and assume combat positions. The creature exits the car. The soldiers give the order to fire and begin shooting at the monster multiple times. The creature appears to be defeated. The soldiers report that the situation has been resolved and that a monster that crossed the gate has been killed. The other soldier wonders where Park went. He wonders if Park had left the area. He probably ran away after seeing the monster. However, that wasn't the case. Meanwhile, the protagonist walks outside the area, mentioning that it was a field, but even so he could feel everything. Moreover, he would have to buy a car for himself. The boy looks around, wondering if except for the city of Seo, all the other cities were completely destroyed. For that reason, he couldn't believe it. Sometime later, night has fallen. Park mentions that the darkness felt very familiar. He starts walking among the ruins, saying it's time to hunt. Shortly after, he falls to the ground, assuming that his body felt a bit heavy. Meanwhile, he observes some buildings. Then, he begins to run quickly toward them. He successfully climbs them, reaching the top. At the top of a building, Park stood tall with the moon behind him, creating a scene that was nothing short of epic. But he wasn't there just to look cool. The protagonist closed his eyes and focused, activating his senses to figure out the best direction to take. He quickly turned his head to the side and decided to start there. He descended the building effortlessly. The grip on those shoes must be from another planet. Wandering through the empty streets, he approached a dark alley that looked suspicious. At the far end, a pack of goblins had cornered a defenseless dog, ready to make it their dinner. The drool dripping from the monsters' mouths left no doubt. They were starving. But that dog wasn't going down easy. It fought with everything it had. That's when, stepping out from the shadows, our boy appeared. He looked at the dog and, in a slightly ironic tone, asked if it wanted help. Maybe the desperate look in its eyes said yes, but it didn't matter. The goblins had already made their choice. They charged at the human. Perfect. Park grinned and ran straight into the fight. In the blink of an eye, he spun around and struck from behind. The first goblin got punched so hard that its head literally sank into its own body, just like that. But then something even weirder happened. A bunch of system windows started popping up in front of him. Error messages appeared one after another, and our protagonist had no idea what was going on. The screen seemed to be saying something went wrong while recognizing his actions. While he tried to make sense of it all, the other goblins took advantage of the distraction and attacked. They were full of confidence, which was completely shattered when, one by one, they got their teeth knocked out with a single hit each. Total knockout. The last goblin, after watching the massacre of his buddies, tried to run. In a panic, he climbed up the building, but he made a fatal mistake. He stopped at the top and looked back, like he wanted to see the monster he had just faced, and he saw it. Park caught up to him, threw him off the edge, and the fall ended his life. Back on the ground, another system window appeared, warning of an error when trying to display his class abilities. That triggered a memory, about 100 years ago when he was butt naked and running through a forest trying to survive. That's when he started earning status points. Could it be that even here, on Earth, these system windows still work? And more importantly, do the errors have anything to do with his body being weaker ever since he returned to this world? Suddenly, a new window appeared titled Achievement Shop. Curious, Park decided to check it out. He had 7 points available and a few item options to buy. Nothing too flashy, but he picked a few, and like magic, the items appeared right in front of him. Before he could even taste the food, a sound caught his attention. It was the same dog from before, but this time, it wasn't alone. A puppy stood by its side. Park approached slowly, placed his hand on the dog's body, and realized it was dying. The animal, trusting its instincts, felt it could finally rest. But Park wasn't ready to let go so easily. In silence, the dog seemed to plead, "Take care of my pup." How could he forget? In the other world, wolves were his family. Maybe fate was repeating itself. He pulled a snack from his pocket and offered it to the dog. Maybe it was hungrier than Park himself. After that, he stood up and walked toward the goblin corpses scattered on the ground, 7 in total. It was still night, but it wasn't until sunrise that he finished what he had started. He made a simple grave for the dog that had died protecting its pup, and he stayed there, in silence, honoring that moment. Meanwhile, at the entrance of Area 27, traffic was chaos. Honking horns, stressed drivers trying to get through, but all that noise stopped when a figure approached, carrying several dead goblins on his back. Even though they were lifeless, the sight of those monsters made the crowd step back. The protagonist sold the bodies and got over 10 grand for the loot. The most valuable item? The crystals inside each monster. That's the real prize. Since he didn't have a bank account in his name, the payment came entirely in cash. Surprised by the amount, he started to wonder how much more he could earn if he began dungeon crawling and collecting more crystals. Elsewhere in the city, we see a truck parked near a convenience store. Inside, a man was chatting with an old friend while buying a chocolate bar for his kid. Back at the truck, the man looked cheerful. It had been a calm workday, and now all he wanted was to go home. But the peaceful vibe didn't last long. On his way back, someone suddenly called out his name, Park Jun-ho, and without warning, he took a brutal punch that sent him straight to the ground. Mentioning that it had been a long time and that they were worried because he had said he would abandon his child and run away. The man looks and seems to recognize that person. Then, the others start beating Jun-ho, Park's brother, saying that he seemed better than the last time they saw him, asking how many times he thought they had come there. Shortly after, Jun-ho takes out some money and mentions that this was the payment he had received. Counting the bills, the man says that the monthly fee was 8,000 Brazilian real, and the accumulated interest was more than 6,000 Brazilian real. So there was still money missing. With tears in his eyes, Jun-ho apologizes, saying that if he couldn't get the money, they should wait 3 days. Hitting him again, the man asks how much he thought 3 days of interest were, telling him to stop lying. At that moment, someone calls out for Jun-ho. The other man asks who that person was. Jun-ho is shocked to realize that his brother is still alive. Shortly after, Park approaches his brother and asks if he is Jun-ho. Then, a flashback shows Jun-ho being bullied by other people. Immediately after the protagonist is seen watching the situation, Jun-ho begs his brother for help. However, Park seemed to completely ignore it, leaving Jun-ho alone in that situation and walking away. Thus, his brother was never much help in his life. The flashback shows news of unknown explosions spreading across the country. Additionally, red spheres, which were portals, begin appearing along with the explosions. Jun-ho, watching all of this, is shocked. He runs toward his mother's room. His parents are happy because he was home. However, they still didn't know the whereabouts of the other brother. At that moment, an explosion occurs and several monsters begin to appear. Meanwhile, a giant eye is watching Jun-ho. Shortly after, he disappears. Returning to the present, Park seems pleased, mentioning that Jun-ho had grown since the last time he saw him. Jun-ho responds that he thought Park was dead. Immediately after, the other guy interrupts the situation. He asks if that man was really Jun-ho's older brother. At that moment, Park grabs the boy's head. In seconds, the boy is thrown back. Jun-ho watches in shock. The protagonist threw the guy so hard that he flew to the side. The two henchmen are stunned by what they just saw. Park asks if his brother is hurt. He replies that he's fine. At that moment, the other guy charges at Park. Park attempts to kick him. However, it seemed to have no effect. The man's leg simply broke. Falling to the ground, the guy begins writhing in pain. The other guy is still trembling in fear. He assumes that the protagonist is an awakened being. Shortly after, Park tells the man to come at him. However, the man responds that he hadn't hurt him. He says Park had to believe him. He told those people to leave him alone. Shortly after, Park hands some money to the man. He tells him to take the money and leave. Sometime later, night has fallen. That elderly woman appears. In front of her, the protagonist, along with his brother, watches. The woman asks if he was sure that man was his brother. Jun-ho responds that he's sure. Park, calling the woman grandma, mentions that he brought some meat. The woman says there should be contact as it's family. She asks them to hurry up because the boy had fallen asleep, waiting for his father to come home. Inside the house, a boy seems to be sleeping. Park asks Jun-ho if that was his son. Jun-ho responds that his name is Gung-ho and that he's his only treasure. Park asks where the boy's mother was. Jun-ho replies that she had left to live her own life, but it was his fault for not providing enough for his family. Park, trying to change his mood, says they should have a drink. Later, they are at the table drinking. Jun-ho responds that after Park disappeared, he thought he was dead all this time, but he was alive without even having aged. Park asks how much money he owed. Jun-ho responds that it was around 220,000 Brazilian real, but it's okay because he's sure he'll manage to handle his debts. He says he has a job now. The protagonist asks what kind of job he has. Jun-ho responds that he works at a logistics center. Park asks if the truck was his. Jun-ho replies that it wasn't, and that it used to belong to his grandmother's son. However, he had rented it from her. Once again, the protagonist asks what his grandmother's son used to do. Then, Jun-ho responds that he had heard that Park had died during the Great Disaster. Shortly after, the boy wakes up, realizing there was a dog in front of him. Looking to the side, he finds his father. Jun-ho, happy, asks if his son had already woken up. Embarrassed, the boy asks who that man was. His father replies that it was his uncle, asking him to greet him. A while later, the boy is seen playing with the dog. Jun-ho thinks it's good to see that. The boy had always wanted a dog. Park suggests that the two of them should work together. However, Jun-ho seems confused by this. Park responds that he will do all the work. He just asks for help with the truck. Jun-ho, on the other hand, asks what he was planning to do. Park replies that he wants to hunt some monsters. This leaves Jun-ho completely surprised by what he just heard. Sometime later, the scene cuts to the command center. That girl is congratulating the protagonist. The protagonist registers as an awakened being. Somehow, he had managed to increase his stats in just one day. Park asks if he is now an F-rank druid. The girl responds that now he could use his identification to open a bank account. She says he could carry out financial transactions. Handing something to him, she mentions that it was a small gift. It was for registering as an awakened being. Also, he shouldn't forget to download the Awakened Central app. She tells him to gather enough dimensional energy to become a ranker. He should be eligible for pensions and many other benefits. She asks if the protagonist knew how to open a status window. Due to recent technical issues, the interface had undergone changes. At that moment, Park says the keyword. The system screen appears, showing all his stats. Observing this, Park wonders why his stats were so low. Then, the scene cuts to the truck belonging to Park's brother. He is happy because his brother managed to get a phone. He congratulates him on officially becoming an awakened being. In the middle of the call, he says he's on his way, so he'll meet his brother there as soon as he delivers the last batch. Now that Park has become an awakened being on paper, all that remains is the mercenary test. However, Park replies that before they do that, they should pay off his debt. Juno responds that he's still an F rank, so he doesn't think they're ready to hunt monsters yet. However, the protagonist hangs up on him. Juno wonders if this was really his brother. It seemed like he had completely changed. As he walks toward the location, the protagonist says the gate seems to be closed. Meanwhile, on Route 77, a group of people seems to be in a rush because they're going to miss their game. Inside the car, a group of people seems nervous. However, the other guy tells them to relax. He asks why they're scared since they're awakened after all. He questions if they had forgotten they could officially become raiders in the guild, because if they succeeded, they'd be able to clear that dungeon. Annoyed, the other guy thinks that these people are very incompetent. They were doing it for the money and wouldn't have come this far without their connections. Shortly after, the soldier calls for the next person. Thus, the man is surprised, and the protagonist appears again in that place. The soldier asks if he's alone. Park responds that he is. Shortly after, Park places his card on the reader. The soldier begins pulling up some data on the protagonist. He asks if Park knew that was a ranking with limits, so he couldn't enter just any dungeon. Meanwhile, the man from before is observing the protagonist, who is entering that place completely alone. The other soldier asks if he thought the protagonist would be okay. After all, he didn't even have the proper equipment. However, the other guy tells him not to worry, because that was the guy who single-handedly dealt with 7 goblins at Gate 27. The other guy in the car, apparently jealous of the protagonist, wonders who he thought he was, wondering if he was going into the field like that. For that reason, he thought Park was crazy. The other soldier then apologizes for the delay, saying he was having some technical issues. Finishing the verification, the guy tells his friend to speed up, because they're going to follow the protagonist's route. However, he becomes confused, because the boy had simply disappeared in the middle of that tunnel. The other guy wonders where Park had gone, and the man thinks he might have encountered something very interesting. Meanwhile, the scene cuts to the forest, and Park seems to be running through the place. Shortly after, he stops, saying that this must be the current state of his body. So, it seemed like Park had become very weak. He needed to motivate himself to improve and start training again. Looking at something, he seems surprised. He was hearing strange voices, and he guessed it could be the sound of a sword battle. A little further ahead, the boy noticed something, and he assumed that the sound was coming from that direction. Shortly after, the young man smiled, thinking that a fight between civilized beings rather than beasts could be a very good opportunity. For that reason, he couldn't afford to miss it. The scene then cuts to someone losing their arm. Above that battle, the protagonist coldly observes, and in the midst of the commotion, a group of people is being surrounded. Park, irritated, says that it seemed like it would take all day for them to start killing. Meanwhile, a man steps out of a car. He asks why it's taking so long to deal with those people. The soldier, observing the man, seems surprised. Then, irritated, the man tells them to deal with it at once. Another man says that person had a bounty of 200,000 Brazilian real on his head. Meanwhile, the protagonist is observing what the man is saying, surprised by the amount he could receive if he killed that person. The soldier, watching that man, seemed astonished. Thus, the group seemed ready to finish off those people. The man then affirms that his bounty is that amount, so they should try to catch him if they could. However, the group didn't seem very confident, wondering if, even giving their all, they would be able to win. At that moment, the man charges at the people. Within seconds, the protagonist appears, heading toward the other soldiers. The man, watching Park, becomes confused, and the other soldier wonders who that man was, who then begins walking toward the other soldier. The guy asks who he is. Park, on the other hand, asks if he really said the bounty on his head was that high. The man, confirming it, asks who the boy was, and Park responds that he was just someone who needed a lot of money. The man's subordinates wonder who this boy could be. Shortly after, the man starts laughing at the protagonist, mentioning that it seemed he wasn't part of the central office, so it would have been better for him to mind his own business. At that moment, the protagonist starts to feel something strange, wondering what was happening to his body. The man explains that Park had looked into his eyes for more than 5 seconds, which meant he would no longer be able to move. Shortly after, the man gives an order for his soldiers to charge at Park, who then point their swords at the boy. However, the protagonist is able to move again, leaving everyone completely shocked by what had just happened. With a smile on his face, Park asks if that was magic, mentioning that it was very interesting. Then the man uses his binding ability again, immobilizing the protagonist once more, who says that it was expected because he wasn't a small fly. He then draws his dagger, saying that the man should have thought twice before messing with him. But at that moment, Park strikes the man, who seems to have been injured by the attack. Park asks if he had any other tricks up his sleeve. He then punches the man, and a flurry of punches follows. The man is thrown back where he appears to have been defeated. Park, for his part, says that it was all very boring. The other guy thinks that to deal with that man so easily, Park must be incredibly strong, and he wonders who the protagonist really was. Meanwhile, the group of soldiers continues watching the boy. Park asks if they still wanted to fight. The group responds that they didn't. Shortly after, the protagonist points to a place, telling them to go there, asking if anyone happened to have a rope. One of the men responds that he had one. The protagonist then asks what there was. However, the group responds that they didn't have a bounty because they had no choice and were forced to work with that man, or they would be killed. So delivering that man would be enough to make him rich. With tears in his eyes, the man couldn't believe that his companions had betrayed him, abandoning him after he had helped them all this time. Park, for his part, asks if he had finally woken up. The group begins insulting the man, saying that he was just a piece of trash. The boy then asks if he wouldn't get anything for getting rid of those people. Then the other man mentions that they were lying, as they were all criminals too. Surely some of them must have bounties. However, the group responded that it wasn't true. They claimed they were really just useless vagabonds. Park, on the other hand, was called by the man, asking what the city's laws were that made him feel so unrestricted, because in that place, right there, the land was true freedom. So if he let him go, he would do whatever he could to make Park live like a king. But at that moment, the protagonist kicks the man again, telling him to be quiet. The man seemingly passed out. Park then asks if the man was saying that all those people had bounties on their heads. The man answers yes, since most of them were former criminals. Unhappy, the man thinks that it was his end. Park asks if there weren't too many to take with them, and the boy says they could leave them behind. The protagonist replies that it was time for everyone to take a nap. Sometime later, the scene cuts to a car driving down the road. Inside, the boy says they really needed his help, so they had to repay him somehow. However, the protagonist replies that they didn't need to do that. The other man then says that, thanks to Park, they managed to leave that place alive. Park says that if they wanted to see it that way, they could do something for him. The group then begins to ask several questions, like what his special powers and abilities were. The man responds that his awakened ability was swordsmanship, and he learned to track by investigating through skill books. Park, surprised, realizes that one could learn magic through books. The man, also surprised, asks if Park really didn't know what a skill book was. Meanwhile, the protagonist thinks it would be better to learn 1 or 2 combat magic abilities, as they could probably be useful in the future. However, something surprises him, because before him, a giant light is surrounding the area. He asks if that was a portal. The boy is surprised by the question, saying yes and mentioning that it was a level 1 dungeon, the lowest level, which is why they were planning to go there. Park says it's a pity, because he might have been able to go to that place if he at least had a mercenary license. The man, shocked by what he heard, asks if Park really didn't have a license. Park replies that he really didn't have one. When a portal opens, a military first secures the area, and any monsters found in the fields are just small fry that somehow survive the attacks. And the experience one could gain in those low-level fields, where level 1 dungeons are open and rank as E, could even allow one to surpass that level. In other words, you should actually go to level 2 dungeons. The man, still confused, wonders how this rookie, who hadn't even gone to a level 1 dungeon, managed to defeat that C-ranked man. Park, noticing the man staring at him, asks what he wanted. The man apologizes, asking if he could know what Park's rank was. Kim then informs him that it was F rank, leaving the man completely stunned by what he heard. Park then asks what favor he should request. The scene cuts to the portal from earlier. From it, a person seems to be emerging. That man from before is in the area. His group seems somewhat injured after entering the portal. As a result of everything that happened during the battle, another boy had lost his hand. For that reason, they quickly needed a doctor. The man, irritated, wonders if mercenary licenses were being handed out to anyone these days. The first thing he's going to do when he gets back to the guild is kick the person who chose those fools. However, the other boy asks him to calm down, saying he shouldn't be so hard on the rookie since he knows the guild's condition these days. Even knowing all of this, the man is still very frustrated. He thinks that people with rich parents can easily enter that place and become awakened, and after that, their parents hire mercenaries to carry them through the dungeons. Suddenly, they're ready to join the guild and go on missions. However, it's the guild members who suffer for accepting those useless people. The guy, noticing his captain's irritation, asks if they shouldn't cool their heads. That's why they should have a drink. The man then asks how everything is going as a level 1 dungeon was about to disappear. He asks if anything had happened, and a soldier responds that something big did, as someone had just delivered 10 looters to them, and among the captives, there was a rank C who had certainly heard of him. The man asked if any high-ranking individual was supposed to visit them at the camps that day. However, the soldier replied no, saying it was a rank F novice who didn't have a mercenary license and managed to capture that man. In disbelief, the man asked how that happened. The soldier answered that he didn't know the details, but according to witnesses, the rank F had simply beaten that man up. The man was then surprised, guessing it might have been the person he had seen before in the tunnel. He asked where that rank F had gone. The soldier in turn replied that he had seen him heading toward the portals. Quickly, the man headed toward the portals again, thinking he had to witness that boy's ability with his own eyes. And if it was worth it, he might gain something valuable from that story. Soon after, the man ended up getting inside a truck. The other guy then asked what the problem was. The man asked if the boy who had captured the man earlier had just entered the portal. Meanwhile, the protagonist along with his brother was entering a portal, mentioning that this time it hadn't hurt at all, and the clothes seemed to be doing fine. Junior replied that items without dimensional energy couldn't pass through the portals, but as they had just seen, those clothes passed smoothly because they were made from materials found in the dungeons. Looking to the side, Park seemed confused, asking what that thing in front of him was. Junior then responded that it was called a door, and the portal they had just entered was one of several doors that gave access to all 38 dungeons. At the same moment, the two were surprised. Park asked why the door had disappeared. Then the man answered that it would reappear once they had finished the dungeon. The protagonist asked if they had to kill all the monsters. The boy responded that no, they only had to kill the strongest one, the boss. Stretching, our boy replied that he would finish this quickly. However, Junior asked him to wait, but the protagonist didn't seem to have heard any of that, so he quickly jumped. The man, surprised, wondered who that man was, thinking he might be the guy from the rumors. With that level of power, he could very well break the record time for clearing a level 1 dungeon. However, he soon realized something, because they didn't even have tracking abilities, so they wouldn't be able to find the door's location within the time limit. Because of that, if they got stuck there, they might disappear along with the portal. Then the scene cuts back to the man with the analyzer. The door the protagonist had entered had just closed. This made the man very angry with what he had heard. Then the scene cuts back to inside the protagonist's portal. Some monsters were wandering around that place. However, one of them was suddenly hit by something and thrown back. Park, observing everything, said they were carrying very interesting things, and he began extracting the stone inside them, mentioning that there was only one blood crystal after killing 3 of them. But still, what was most important at that moment was leveling up. Meanwhile, that guy was watching everything Park had done, wondering how many monsters he had killed. Soon after, the boy ended up using his tracking ability, finding the protagonist's location, and was checking his stats, mentioning that he could buy 2 abilities with 102 achievement points. Then, he ended up buying a beast taming ability. At that moment, 2 monsters began charging toward him. Noticing this, he began immobilizing them and easily defeated them. The system notified him that he had earned the achievement. The system notified him again that there was a critical error, as a data synchronization conflict was in progress. Park, confused, wondered what that was. Then it was reported that the boy had leveled up to level 2, feeling happy because his stats had increased as usual. Because of this, he went on to buy the next Tree Spirit ability with 100 points. Then, the system notified him that he had finally acquired the ability. The boy then asked to summon the tree spirit. A light began to surround the place, and a kind of green spirit started to appear. Park, surprised, thought it was him. When he had seen it for the first time in the jungle, he thought it had been some kind of firefly. So he asked the tree spirit to search for the missing goblins. Following the protagonist's orders, the spirit left, beginning to search for the missing monsters. Park said that the tree spirit transmitted the memories it read from the vegetation and trees into his mind. However, it was still a bit slow, and he wondered if it was because his level was still low. At that moment, he started to analyze his status window along with his abilities. He then noticed that he had two abilities, one for searching and the other for tracking. Because of this, he decided to buy both to keep improving. Immediately, he placed his hand on the ground. He began using his searching ability, stating that it was a reference point. Then he used his tracking ability, receiving the information that the goblins were already dead. However, he was surprised. Looking to the side, he assumed that it wasn't just an ordinary goblin. At that moment, he rushed toward that place, astonished by what he saw. The boy from earlier was being attacked by a different monster. Park, on the other hand, asked what he was doing. Then he smiled, happy that the protagonist had returned. The young man then asked if he hadn't said he would hunt alone. However, the young man replied that, in fact, he was the one being hunted. Then he begged the protagonist for help. Immediately, the protagonist rushed toward the creature, managing to block the attack. Quickly, he recovered his stance, but within seconds, Park struck again, throwing the creature against a rock. As a result, the monster was completely covered in blood. However, there was no time to think as Park was already above him. Thus, he managed to finish the monster and the system notified that he had leveled up. He earned 120 achievement points. The young man observing the protagonist was amazed by his skills. Park then assumed that the door should have already opened. The young man confirmed that he was right. A while later, the two had already left the portal, and that group from before was watching the two of them. One of the men wondered if it was the same guy who had captured the bounty man earlier. He mentioned that Captain Kang had asked to be contacted if the protagonist returned. Looking at some information, the man wondered what the completion time for that dungeon had been. Meanwhile, the boy said he needed to return to his teammates. So, he said he would get in touch later. Park in turn confirmed this, saying he would leave all the clothes in the warehouse. The scene then shifted to that location, and Park had already changed his clothes, mentioning that he was very hungry. However, he was surprised. A man had appeared, asking if his name was Park. The boy asked who he was. The man introduced himself as Kang, the captain of the 27th combat team of the guild. He asked if he could have a few minutes of his time. Later, the protagonist and that unknown man seemed to be discussing something. Park, meanwhile, asked if he was from the Sheila Guild. The man invited him to join his guild, offering to provide an environment to help him grow. However, the boy responded that he wasn't interested in that. The man, irritated, asked what was wrong with the kid, as he was refusing to join a guild without even thinking about it. He said that if he was already associated with a guild, they could make an official offer. However, the boy responded that he wasn't in any guild. The man said that they might be in 4th place, but he needed to know that there was practically no difference in strength between the top guilds. However, the boy replied that he didn't like being under other people's. Then time passed again. Park was apparently already at home, saying it seemed like they hadn't returned yet. As he lay down, he thought they might be enjoying some quality time together as father and son. Shortly after, an old woman appeared, asking why young people these days like to disrespect time so much. The protagonist then replied that she should sit down too, as the weather was perfect for a nap. However, the woman replied that she was hanging up clothes and didn't have time for that. Seeing his grandmother doing all of that by herself, the boy ended up helping her. Then the grandmother asked if he was really Junho's older brother. The protagonist answered that he was. Soon after, the woman mentioned that it was a pleasant surprise as Benjamin was at their house. But Park responded that it wasn't true. It was the opposite. The woman replied that with all those strange monsters appearing out of nowhere and causing havoc, she thought looking younger wasn't something to be surprised about. She said she had heard it had been 10 years since he had seen his brother. Because of that, she wondered if he would take care of himself and not break his family's heart again. Hearing what the woman said, Park smiled. He asked her not to worry, saying he wouldn't die so easily. Soon after, the boy's brother, along with his son, appeared. They greeted the protagonist. Then Park handed a piece of paper to the man, who looked confused and asked what it was. Park explained that it was the money he owed, and he should use it to surround his life. He told him to pay his debt quickly so they could have dinner together. Emotional, his brother asked how he could repay such a favor. However, Park told him not to get too sentimental and that he should just go. With tears in his eyes, the man left. Park then called out to his brother again. He asked if he had enough money to buy food and drinks on his way back. The man replied that he did, and he would return before they even noticed. Park stayed on the terrace taking care of his nephew. At that moment, a system screen appeared, indicating that the target was following him and that he should name it. Park wondered what he should call the dog. The child suggested it should be named Baku. Hearing that name, Park replied that it didn't sound too bad. From that moment on, the dog would be called Baku. Time passed. The child, lying down, said he was very hungry and wondered why his father hadn't arrived yet. Noticing his brother's truck, Park assumed that his brother had already arrived, so he decided to go welcome him. Shortly after, the child, along with the protagonist, headed toward the truck. However, the man appeared, covered in blood, and collapsed on the ground. Park, seeing this, wondered why it happened. Sometime later, the scene shifted to a building at night. Meanwhile, a group of people inside the building seemed to be playing a card game. One man asked if the fight should start that week. Another man replied yes, saying that he'd seen all the online communities were betting on the man named Miho. The man asked if there was any news from Horizon, as last time they went there, it lost a lot of money. At that moment, someone was banging loudly on the door. Irritated, the man asked what the noise was. Then, the other men stood up to see what the commotion was. At that moment, the door burst open, and a silhouette of a man appeared, completely covered in blood. Immediately, someone grabbed the head of the man, dragging him out of the door. The men, watching the situation, wondered why it happened. Then, a piercing gaze was directed at the door, and from that point, chaos erupted. The group, shocked, couldn't understand what was happening. Within seconds, a cabinet and a weapon were thrown in their direction. A commotion broke out. Several people were thrown around. The boss, watching it all, was surprised as the protagonist had taken down everyone in a matter of seconds. Another man asked if he knew who that person was. The man replied that he seemed to be awakened. At that moment, the protagonist threw a table at the man. Immediately after, he climbed on top of it, asking if his name was Kim. Irritated, the man said that was indeed his name, demanding to know who the protagonist was. The boy replied that someone wanted to settle Park Jong-ho's debt. The man said he must be insane, asking if he called himself awakened after beating up honest, hard-working people. He told him not to think he would get away with it. At that moment, the man received a slap to the face. Park asked what that had to do with it, and why he slapped him just because he wanted to pay off his debt. He said all he should have done with his brother was take the money and leave. He asked why he had crossed the line and done that to his own brother. As he received the slaps, the man begged to be left alone. Park, in turn, asked if he wanted to settle the debt or get beaten until he died. Without even thinking, the man said he would settle everything at once. A while later, the entire group was kneeling before Park, saying that from that moment on, their client, John Rodham, would no longer have any obligations to them and all his debts would be paid. Park then replied that if they ever saw them again, they should consider themselves dead. He told them to make sure not to cross his path. Kneeling, they all confirmed what the boy had said. However, one of the men still didn't seem to have given up. Sometime later, the man mentioned that the protagonist had already left. Irritated, the man, plotting his plans, wondered if the boy really thought he didn't have people backing him. Once again, the scene shifted to a building, and that guild leader from earlier mentioned that he had found new talent. He asked to take a look at this person, that he showed some information about Park. However, the man noted that he was just a rank F, and besides that, he had registered as an Awaken only that day. The other man said that was all more reason to be interested, as they could take a closer look at his profile. But the system notified that access had been denied. They wondered what kind of person he was. However, they managed to bypass the security and access the information. They still wanted to know why his profile was confidential. It seemed he hadn't joined a guild yet, and there appeared to be more to his story. Then, the man asked to check his abilities. The boy mentioned that he was a type of conjurer. Moreover, he had previously defeated a man with a high bounty in a very easy manner. He asked if they knew that this man had been missing for 10 years, which made the situation strange. They wondered if he might be a special agent. The man then said he thought he would be strong because of his abilities, and never considered he might be a member of an intelligence service. The boy then said they should give up on recruiting this person because he was 100% certain that he belonged to another country. He mentioned that he knew this would happen the moment there was all that fuss. Wanting to change the subject, the other man suggested they go have coffee. He asked why a special agent would have entered a level 1 dungeon. The boy asked why it mattered so much. Again, the man asked him to keep an eye on the protagonist, but the boy seemed reluctant to do so. The scene then shifted to a hospital. The protagonist was visiting his brother, asking if he was awake yet. Juno then noticed that his brother had arrived, asking why he had bought so much food. Juno replied that he had heard he ate a lot, and it helped with recovery. Park, in turn, asked if he was feeling better. Juno responded that he would be able to remove his bandages the next day. He then asked if his mercenary test was tomorrow. The boy replied that it was. Juno said it would be great if he could pass the test and be invited to a guild. However, the protagonist didn't seem to want that. He thought to himself that he had once been the king of the forest. For that reason, he couldn't join a group and become someone's lackey. Juno then asked that he should look into some high-ranking guilds for him to join. The boy replied that there was no need because he would make his own guild. In disbelief, Juno asked if he was really going to create a guild instead of joining one. Sometime later, the scene shifted to the adventurer's agency. Meanwhile, Shui seemed to be walking through the building. Shortly after, an older man called out to her. He asked what had happened to her in recent days. He mentioned that there had been 2 breaches in her area, and if yesterday's portal had been a bridge portal, the city would have been in ruins by now. The girl then asked if they couldn't do anything without her. However, the man asked her to help because the portal department manager had been bothering him all day. What he was trying to say was that she was wasting her talent, but the girl replied that it had been hard to stay focused lately. Handing her a paper, the man told her to stop talking nonsense and read it at once. Shui, in turn, was surprised because they had sent her to do manual labor when she thought she was finally going to have a break. But the man replied that she wasn't the only one and it wasn't the first time anyway. Immediately after, the girl, irritated, began to leave the place. The man asked her not to go around rejecting candidates just because she was upset. He reminded her that they were short on people and needed every person they could get. Shui replied that it was better to reject those idiots who couldn't protect themselves. Shortly after, the scene shifted to another location. A group of people was discussing how they needed to pass that test. Meanwhile, a man appeared doing a live stream on YouTube. Everyone in that place was eager to take the test to get their mercenary license. Soon after, a different group of people entered the area. The man noted that they would have to end the stream because the test was about to begin. At that moment, the protagonist appeared staring at that boy. The boy then asked if it was the first time Park was watching the live stream. Park asked who he was talking to as the boy requested some space. Soon after, the supervisor introduced himself saying he would be in charge of everything for the next 3 days. The 21 supervisors present that day would evaluate whether they had what it took to pass the test. He'd assumed that everyone had received a ticket with their number upon arrival. They would begin the selection of supervisors through a random draw. So when their name was called, they were to form a single line in front of their supervisor. Time passed and many people were called, until it was the protagonist's turn who received number 15. However, he was surprised by something. His supervisor would be that blonde girl from before. Observing her, he mentioned it had been a long time since he had seen her. The boy recognized her immediately, and the man asked them to head to their respective waiting rooms and rest until further announcements were made. Meanwhile, the boy who had been streaming earlier was heading to the location, bragging to his viewers that it would be tough to pass the test. However, he seemed like he would leave the next day. It was then revealed that the streamer from earlier was also in the room where the protagonist was. Looking to the side, he noticed the boy, asking why he looked so sad when he had been so excited earlier. Looking at the protagonist, he realized it was the same guy from before, asking if he ever heard about that blonde girl's craziness because there was a reason everyone called her a witch. That girl was the type to eliminate someone just because she was having a bad day. Park, in turn, asked why it was the supervisor's fault and not the fault of those who weren't prepared. Irritated, the boy thought that Park had just ignored his words, knowing from the start he was useless, asking if he cared to show respect to his seniors. However, the protagonist replied that if he had a problem, he should solve it like real men with a fight. The boy then asked if he thought he was easy prey. Quickly, Park responded that he did. Irritated, the boy said he was going crazy and told Park to follow him. Meanwhile, Choi had arrived at the location. However, she noticed that no one was there. Annoyed, she wondered where everyone had gone. The scene then cut to a ring arena, and the protagonist, along with the boy, was preparing for a fight. The boy said that Park was very unlucky because he should have fought twice before wanting to fight him, asking if he had never heard of TV Kaboo since despite appearances, he was a promising YouTuber. And however, Park seemed unaware of what that was asking if it was some kind of food. This made the boy even more irritated, and he mentioned that he would have to teach Park a lesson. Everyone in the stands was very excited about the fight, fully cheering for the streamer, saying one of his hobbies was teaching manners to disrespectful kids like Park. Watching all of this, the protagonist remarked that everything seemed quite fun. The streamer then warned Park not to ask him to cover his hospital expenses after he was done with him. At that moment, he charged at the protagonist, throwing a punch. However, Choi appeared at the scene, ordering everyone to return to the waiting room immediately. As a result, the group hurriedly left. Watching the protagonist and the man, Choi asked if they were desperate to fail the test, and she didn't need an explanation. One of them just had to take the blame. Whoever lost would fail the test, and they should continue the fight. The streamer, watching this, thought it was expected because that woman was crazy. Then Park prepared for the battle. The streamer asked him not to be nervous, reminding him that it was the protagonist who had asked for this. Park, in turn, apologized for what was about to happen. At that moment, the boy charged at Park, but within seconds, he was struck by a punch and was quickly knocked out. Choi, watching this, was surprised, thinking that ever since the day she met him, she had felt an uncomfortable sensation that wouldn't go away. Park, looking at Choi, asked why she seemed so distracted, saying that if she won a fight too, she should get into the ring. However, he had one condition. If he won, she couldn't disqualify the other guy. Choi, in turn, said the boy must be crazy. Then she entered the ring, asking if the young man was perhaps an irregular. However, Park didn't know what that meant, and asked who it was. Then the girl lunges at the protagonist, who manages to dodge the attack. Thus, Choi starts attacking the young man repeatedly. He seemed to only be on the defensive. Just as she was about to attack again, Choi says that if he wins, she would grant him that request. However, she ends up receiving a fatal blow from the girl, thinking something was wrong because he was definitely hiding something. Shortly after, she is surprised, and the protagonist responds that she was stronger than he had thought. The girl is then surprised because Park was able to withstand her attack. At that moment, she charges at him again, saying that this time it was really over. She gets the boy with another attack, following up with a series of attacks on him. However, out of nowhere, he seems to start fighting back. Thus, he lands a punch on the girl, even managing to break her shield. However, it still wasn't enough. But even so, she was surprised that Park was able to break her shield. Shortly after, the boy charges at her again, declaring that this was a lot of fun. Choi, for her part, says that he really was an irregular. Park, still confused, asks what that meant. Then the girl responds that she surrenders. The protagonist, confused, asks why, since the fight was just getting good. The girl replies that the place was too small to use her abilities, and that they should fight in a larger area next time. Park, on his part, asks if there were strong girls like her on Earth, to which Choi responds there weren't many. Shortly after, the protagonist says he chooses her, and for that reason, they should make babies, asking if she wanted to mate with him. However, the girl slaps him across the face. Meanwhile, that streamer finally wakes up, wondering what had happened. At the same time, Choi was very irritated by that and starts walking away. That guy was still surprised, as he had been knocked out with just one punch. For that reason, he should go home, since he wasted money on the application without even taking the test, mentioning that it was very embarrassing. Looking at the protagonist, the young man still seemed angry, asking if he was satisfied with that. However, Park responds that he hadn't been disqualified. Meanwhile, the camera was watching them, and the scene cuts to an old man looking at a computer, completely surprised that Choi had lost. Park then calls the streamer to leave together. However, he was still confused, asking why he hadn't been disqualified. Park informs him that he had asked Choi to ignore his disqualification. The streamer still wanted to know why the protagonist got slapped, but the boy responds that he didn't mean to know that. Shortly after, the young man seems to have realized something, supposing that he had been hit because of him. That's why he convinced the girl to ignore the commotion by letting her hit him. Realizing this shortly after, the guy starts to follow Park. At that moment, someone on the intercom calls Park, asking him to go to the supervisor's office as soon as possible. A while later, our protagonist is in the supervisor's office, discussing with him, asking why he had called him. The man then says that before they talk, he should know that everything was being recorded, and that he had seen his fight with Supervisor Choi, and for that reason, he was surprised that a candidate like him managed to go up against a rank B awakened, asking if the boy was, by chance, an awakened. However, Park still didn't know what that was, mentioning that they had already asked that question twice. The man observing the situation supposes that Park needed more information about the portals. The pit portals connect Earth to 3 other planets. The first was called Aruka, which was the home planet of elves and dwarves. Additionally, that planet had relations with Earth, and from time to time they made exchanges, and the humans who returned from their learned skills related to magic and artifact creation. The next planet was called Gukchun, inhabited by Mimonas and martial artists, who were constantly fighting for their planet's sovereignty. Those martial artists were their allies, while the Mimonas were their enemies. And the last planet was called Meter, a place dominated by orcs. And to make matters worse, that planet was also infested with ferocious monsters. Among the Earthlings who returned from those 3 planets, there are those who learned extremely powerful abilities, and they discovered that their combat power exceeded that of the Awakened. That's why they decided to classify them as irregulars. Hearing the whole story, Park says it was too complicated, but he was sure that the place where he had been wasn't any of those 3 planets. The supervisor on his part is confused by what he heard, wondering if by chance he was a dungeon returnee, questioning which planet the boy had returned from. Park says that he had already told the previous doctor that he had lived with wolves for over 1,000 years. A while later, the protagonist had finished telling his story. The supervisor then thanks him for sharing, so he could return to his waiting room. Shortly after, the protagonist leaves the room. However, the supervisor says that the story was too absurd to be true. At that moment, a man appears in the room introducing himself, saying that he heard he had been called. Then, the boss asks if he could take over as the supervisor of room 15. The man asks if that wasn't the area Captain Choi was in charge of. Confirming it was, the man informs him that she had fled. But the details didn't matter, and he wanted him to monitor candidate Park and then provide a detailed report on him when his test was over. Meanwhile, the protagonist was already in that room with all the candidates waiting for the test to begin. Shortly after, everyone alongside their captains was lined up, and that man from earlier really took over as the supervisor of room 15. The streamer, observing this, asks if Choi had been fired by chance. Then, the man introduces himself, saying his name was Sang, and that he was in charge of supervising Team 15. The minimum requirement for that day's physical test was 9 seconds and a 100-meter dash and an hour to complete the triangle. Shortly after, the test had already begun, and several people were being disqualified quickly. The girl then says that for a healer, there should be an easier test. Sang asks if she thought the monsters would go easy on her just because she was a healer. Thus, the man calls the next candidate. Han is then introduced, saying that 9 seconds was too easy, saying that he would see the protagonist in the next round. Then, Sang gives the signal and Han starts running. The supervisor says that it took a total of 8 seconds, and for that reason, he passed the test. Then, the next candidate is called and the protagonist is preparing. Meanwhile, Han is cheering for the boy, and when the race starts, Park begins to run in a matter of seconds. Everyone around is completely astonished by what they had seen. Shortly after, the director receives a call from someone, saying it was Sergeant Kim, mentioning that the result of candidate Park Soo-ho's physical test had just come out, and that it was quite surprising. Back at the test, there were some reporters taking pictures and recording Park because he was quite impressive. At the same time, another person receives a call, and the girl says she is Miso from the association and the director of the returnee center. The supervisor on the call says he will send some videos of Park, and for that reason, she needed to watch them. Watching those videos, the girl seems surprised. The other guy mentions that Major Young had the ability to detect lies, so they could say that the protagonist had told the truth in that interview. Miso, on the other hand, still didn't believe that the doctor's report was true. To that limit, the boy was probably an irregular, so he had to be at least stronger than a rank B. For that reason, if his story was true, it meant that Park Soo-ho might return from a 4th planet. Shortly after, Miso asks him to make sure no reporters appear at the training grounds again. However, that guy seems surprised, mentioning that it was already too late because the protagonist had already appeared in the news. At that moment, Miso asks to remove all those articles immediately. Then, the scene cuts to several photographers taking some pictures of someone. Meanwhile, the protagonist, alongside Han, was walking down the street. Miso, for her part, thinks that it meant Park somehow managed to maintain his physical status, despite passing through a portal without protective equipment, wondering if, by chance, he was given an F ranking due to his lack of dimensional energy. In any case, if he really had returned from a 4th planet, South Korea might gain an advantage. Regarding the development of the unknown 4th planet, meanwhile, several reporters were trying to enter a certain location. Above there, many participants from the test were eating. Meanwhile, Park, along with Han, was eating as well. Han, surprised, thinks that not just anyone could knock him out on the first try. Noticing Han staring at him, Park asks what's wrong and if he had finished eating already. Han responds that it was nothing, asking if the boy was thirsty, as he would get water for him, thinking that just by watching the builder eat, one could tell that he was on a completely different level. For that reason, he was sure that Park would be a big deal in the future. Shortly after, time passes and Park seems to be about to sleep. Han says that seeing how those lockers were empty, he imagined that the rest of the people had failed the test. For that reason, they were going to be in a lot of trouble. Park asks why he thought that. The guy responds that the next part of the test involved incursions and dungeons, so teams with more members had an easier time, while those with fewer struggled. However, Park tells him not to worry about that, as they didn't need more people. Hearing what the boy said, Han is surprised, thinking he was very good. However, the situation was different, as dungeons had many unpredictable factors, so he thought it would be easier to have more people with different abilities. Park says he had already told him not to worry, and more importantly, asks what he was doing with his phone when he saw him for the first time. The boy then responds that he was streaming on YouTube, asking if by chance Park didn't know about it. Asking if he lived in a cave, the protagonist responds yes, as it was pretty much like that. Taking out his phone, Han says that it was called YouTube. Thus, he begins to show him all the features it had. Shortly after, Park says that he was really a good person. A while later, the two had already left the house, and the boy thinks that his partner had everything it took to become the next YouTube star. Moreover, he was quite a stud and had a perfect body, which is why he even appeared in the headlines for breaking a world record. For that reason, if Park demonstrated combat power in dungeon incursions, it would probably be just a matter of time before he caught the attention of all the guilds. Then Park responds that he really liked the boy, asking him to join his clan. Han, surprised, asks if, by chance, he was planning to create his own clan, and if he wasn't interested in joining a guild. However, the young man responds that he didn't want that. Han, for his part, wondered what would happen if he made a video about the clan's creation, and went on dungeon incursions with the best candidate from the year's mercenary test. Shortly after, the scene cuts to the boy falling to the ground. Boxing was the only thing that helped him endure that rotten childhood he had. Despite continuing to fail, he managed to get professional license. Even so, he would lose hope, but great disasters shatter all of his hopes and dreams. And they say hope is the last thing to die, which is why he ended up becoming a YouTuber. Back in the present, Han thinks that this was what he had been looking for, as he couldn't believe such an opportunity was right in front of him, saying he was willing to do anything for the protagonist. Park, please, says he's starting to liken more so he should about the stream. With tears on his face, the guy says he wouldn't go back on his word. Park, for his part, asks why he suddenly started crying, and Han replies that it was nothing, asking if he knew that he needed at least 3 members for a clan to be officially created. However, Park still didn't seem to know that. Shortly after, an unknown man enters the room. Han then asks why that monk was in that place. Then the man introduces himself, saying his name was Miyuki Jin and that he was assigned to Team 15. At that moment, a device rings, saying that candidates should put on their battle suits. They were to meet in the 3rd floor conference room within 30 minutes. Park, along with Han, watches in surprise, wondering if they really wanted them to put on those suits at such an hour of the night. The protagonist asks if they weren't going into the dungeons the next day. Miyuki Jin responds that it was said that sometimes the Reapers made dungeon incursions at night without any prior notice. Han replies that it was crazy because they were doing it without warning. Then the scene cuts to the room with all the students, saying that the dungeon would be part of the test, and it was located in the 5th sector of Seoul, which was under the Phoenix Guild's protection. For that reason, it was a level 1 dungeon with a total of 250 doors. Park, for his part, asked what it meant to be under protection. Han, in disbelief, was still surprised because the protagonist really didn't know anything. With doors appearing everywhere, the South Korean government found it difficult to manage all of them, so the government hired private mercenary clans to protect the 12 sectors. The guild is the name given to a private mercenary clan contracted by the government in exchange for its services. Guilds gain rights to process the dimensional energy of the dungeons they manage. Park, for his part, asks if it was basically a tax-free zone where they could hunt, and Han responds that it was pretty much like that. The boy thinks he just wanted to form a clan because he missed hunting with his pack. However, now he could even get his own land. Han replies that it was great to have his own dungeon because that way he wouldn't have to pay to use it. Park replies that the goal of his clan was to become a guild. However, Han asks if they shouldn't worry about passing the mercenary test first, wondering if the protagonist was pretending to be dumb. Shortly after, that guy says that this was an image of the portal's location in Sector 5, and that dungeon had only 15 days left before it broke. It was a labyrinth-type dungeon, which had the lowest difficulty level and the fewest monsters of all the dungeons. It was a shame they wouldn't be able to obtain much dimensional energy since the monsters there were extremely weak. Anyway, that was all the man had to say about the dungeon's explanation. Han wonders what that was about because the monsters might not be their biggest problem. If they weren't careful, they could end up getting stuck in the labyrinth. For that reason, if they at least had a tracking ability, half of their problems could be solved. However, Park replies that he had that ability, leaving the boy very surprised by what he heard, wondering if he had really learned that ability before taking the mercenary test, because that ability was extremely expensive, supposing that the protagonist was probably from a rich family and born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Meanwhile, that monk was still standing next to Park. Then Han asks if he had any awakened abilities. Thus, the man remains silent, leaving the two confused by the situation. At that moment, he pulls out some kind of tool. The seaman cuts to a flashback of him. Several monsters surround that house, which quickly advance towards the place, heading toward the monk, starting to completely destroy the house. Shortly after, another monk opens the door and asks them to stop the noise immediately. Maya and Jin ask what he was doing at that hour of the night. The man then requests that the priest be taken with him and the area be evacuated immediately. At that moment, a monster appears behind him and it is swiftly defeated by him. Back in the present, that man seemed to have a frightened expression. Han asks why he looked so scared. The other man then replies that from that moment on, they were going to the marked target. Therefore, they should begin attacking the dungeon as a team led by the supervisor. He hoped that everyone would pass the test and that no one would fail. Shortly after, everyone was heading toward the portal. The soldiers asked everyone to get off the bus, asking if everyone was prepared. Once they entered, they were to act as if they weren't there and follow the agreement. Han says that his team was the only one with 3 members, so he asks if, in case things got dangerous, the supervisor would really help them. However, the man ignores the question and tells them to move quickly. Then Park asks why Han is so scared. He asks if they were allowed to use their personal weapons. The soldier responds that they were. Surprised, Han wonders if that monk had a weapon made of dimensional material for the mercenary tests. Meanwhile, the entry of each group into the portal was being completed. Soon after, the soldier tells the group to enter. Thus, Team 15 enters the portal. Han wonders why Park always goes ahead, which makes him nervous. He asks the boy to establish a perimeter first, but at that moment, he falls silent, thinking he had lost points for not entering quietly and not holding his position. As a consequence, he ends up attracting the attention of monsters, and one is already in front of the protagonist. Within seconds, the boy grabs the monster and defeats it. Han comments that making noise to catch them off guard and lure them into a trap could be a good idea. He asks if the boy was using tracking while advancing, but at that moment, he steps on a trap, and within seconds, several arrows begin to be fired at them. The scene cuts to a dragon being showered with gunfire. That monk had apparently defeated all the monsters around. With tears in his eyes, he apologizes, saying that it was all his fault. Thus, the monster is obliterated. The scene cuts back to Park's fight. Han, observing the protagonist's skills with the staff, mentions that he was very good. However, he steps on another trap, and as a result, they fall to the floor below. The door apparently closes, leaving everyone trapped in a dungeon. Looking up, they all realize the opening had been sealed. Han, desperate, wonders if this is how all his dreams disappeared, and if they were really going to die there. But in that same instant, he realizes something, saying that they thought they had really attracted more monsters. Then the monk apologizes, mentioning that his awakened ability was an area-wide provocation, which, as a consequence, attracted the attention of the monsters. Park says that's great because he was too lazy to hunt for all the monsters to kill. Shortly after, he jumps out of the dungeon, leaving Han surprised, wondering how someone could kick so hard. Park says he really liked the monk and that he should join his clan. However, that man still didn't seem to understand the situation. Shortly after, a massive horde of monsters appears. Park observes them coldly, and Han begins to use his tracking ability. Seeing all the targets in front of him and all the traps around, he quickly starts running. Han thinks that they really messed up. Then, that monk points his staff at Han, asking him to grab it and climb out. Han says he didn't know anything anymore, as the operation was not what they had planned. When they stand up, they are surprised because the horde of monsters had already been defeated by Park. Observing this, the boy thinks it's insane. Park then asks them to follow him and be careful with the ones who are knocked out. The two do as the boy asked, starting to defeat the remaining monsters. Surprised, the monk wonders if the protagonist was avoiding the traps or using tracking. For that reason, he was advancing at incredible speed, decimating the monsters while using the traps to his advantage. Looking up, he sees a monster behind the protagonist. However, the monk saves him, throwing his staff toward the skeleton. Shortly after, the system informs Park that he acquired 42 conquest points. The scene cuts to an agency. The other soldier says that a team is returning from the dungeon, and the other soldier is surprised because only a few minutes had passed since the test began. He mentions that the dungeon usually takes 2 hours to finish, wondering if an accident had occurred. However, the man says it was Team 20 and all vital signs were normal. Shortly after, that gentleman receives a call. Answering it, he says it was the supervisor asking why they were returning so early, and the soldier on the other end of the line confirms that they had completed the mission. He would understand when he watched the video, but it would be difficult to assess his performance in a level 1 dungeon. Additionally, Park had broken a performance record inside the dungeon. The scene then cuts to the city. Han starts a live stream saying they would be doing daily streams about his clan. One of the viewers asks what they would show today, and the boy replies that they were going to watch the video of Su Clan's house together, as it would be uploaded soon. He then shows where each person's dormitory was. Next, he goes to the protagonist's grandmother's house, asking her to take a look at his subscribers. The grandmother, irritated, says she had many things to do instead of worrying about that. She tells the boy to leave before she slices him. Hearing this, Han falls silent, thinking she wasn't usually like that. She was actually a very nice person. Then Han heads to the room where the protagonist and the monk are. In the middle of the stream, Han introduces the saying his name was Myung-jin. He asks the boy to say something to introduce himself. The monk replies that he had lost a lot in the attack of the evil spirits, but was left with a staff of clairvoyance that his eldest disciple had left behind. At that moment, a truck arrives at the house, hence the protagonist's brother asking if he was ready. So everyone starts heading toward the truck. As they go to the location, a drone flies overhead. Park wonders what that thing flying was, and if he should destroy it. Han is surprised as he didn't know. He says that at the moment they were heading to the mission area in Area 4 of Gate 30. That nearby portal meant that today was their first dungeon mission as a clan. Returning to the stream, the boy asks if his subscribers knew that he had an awakened ability that was video memory. So they shouldn't panic because soon there would be an even better video. Sometime later, the protagonist and his group had already entered the dungeon. Han asks if the boy had any long-range abilities, and the protagonist replies that he didn't. Han, confused, asks how they were going to deal with those bats without such an ability. However, the monk tells him to leave it to him. At that moment, he starts beating on some kind of drum, making a deafening noise. As a result, the entire horde of bats begins moving toward them. Han, surprised, wonders why they were coming out like that. Shortly after, those bats head toward the monk, where he apparently starts using a fire ability. However, it wasn't over yet as a giant bat appears, but it was no use because Park had already sliced it in half. Thus, the mission seemed to be complete. Park mentions that the gate had opened, so they should hurry. Observing all the madness that had happened, the viewers seemed quite in disbelief. Then, the scene cuts to Mizra's office, who apparently wasn't believing what she was seeing. The other guy says that with the thirst those people had in Area 4, the 3 of them were capable of finishing even 20 dungeons a day. Moreover, they were completely decimating all the level 1 dungeons. Taking out his phone, he observes that streamer's channel from earlier. Mizra says that she had done a lot to keep the protagonist out of the news, but unfortunately, one of his guild members was a streamer. The mentions that Park's videos were now ranked 3rd in real-time popularity, so if they left it alone, it would only grow more, asking if they shouldn't take some precautions. The girl, for her part, says that she was well aware of that. Meanwhile, she seemed to be watching a video of the fight between 2 people, and that guy seemed to have easily won the battle. The other person watching was named Lee Sung-woo, an SS rank irregular born in South Korea. Wondering what would happen if the country approached him carelessly under the pretext of protecting a talent and ended up having to deal with the second Lee Sung-woo. She stands up, asking them to prepare to make contact with the protagonist, and for that reason she would meet him personally. Shortly after, the scene cuts back to the protagonist's house. Han, for his part, asks if the monk didn't have work to do. Park wonders where he would go as he didn't have a temple of any sort. Junho replies that he had mentioned he was living in Seoul with a temple family that survived that day. Noticing Han's irritation, Junho asks if the creature couldn't at least rest for a day, since his clan was ready to renew its rank. Moreover, his clan's account had already accumulated 140 million won in total, leaving the boy very surprised by what he had heard. Thinking that he had done nothing but gather the blood crystals, yet his account already had 20 million in 3 days. Park, observing this, remains silent, and the boy continues saying it was insane because if it were true, they would get many donations. Park thinks that he had earned more than 3,000 conquest points, so he should buy some varied abilities since he could get everything now. Thus, he responds that he would take that day to rest. Standing up, Junho says he would take his son and grandmother to the park near that place. Meanwhile, that elderly woman seemed to be feeding the dog. Observing the little dog, Park wonders if dogs, by chance, could awaken like humans. Shortly after, he calls for his brother, mentioning that he had been fixing the truck quite often and asking if it wasn't difficult. Junho replies that he didn't even know where to start and that it was already hard enough to find the parts, but fixing it was exhausting. Then Park asks if he didn't want to buy a new car, leaving Junho very happy with what he had heard. Sometime later, the two seem to be discussing with the manager about which car to get. The man starts explaining the car many times in detail. Park asks if his brother liked it, and Junho quickly responds that he did. With his choice made, Park says he intends to pay in cash, asking if they could drive off immediately. Shortly after, the two leave the place with their new car. Junho seems very happy, saying that the car was incredible and was on a completely different level compared to what he had before. Park mentions that even the passenger seat in that car was amazing and he should have bought it a long time ago. Junho then asks why they were heading to Area 34, wondering if it wasn't a restricted area. The protagonist questions if he had mentioned that he couldn't awaken because he didn't have the money, and for that reason they were going to awaken that day. Shortly after, a scene cuts to the two arriving at the predetermined location. Looking around, there were several destroyed houses. Meanwhile, Junho didn't seem confident about the situation, and the other dog appeared to be on high alert. Park asks if the dog could also sense that smell, because that odor was definitely from a goblin. Junho replies that he wasn't feeling comfortable and asks if they could leave. Shortly after, Park steps out of the car, saying he would be back soon so they should wait with the dog, and he quickly jumps away from the place. Junho didn't seem very pleased with that. Shortly after, the scene cuts to another location. A group of people appeared to be watching the video of the protagonist with his group. The other man says that he was very popular on YouTube, saying that he was an irregular, which is why his combat level was immeasurable. Then the other man says that if he was at that level, he was useless to even hire an assassin. However, even so, they couldn't just leave him alone. The other guy then asks for a list of guilds in Area 4 that had frequent sponsorships. Thus, he remembers the name Shui. But there was another person who was better suited for the situation, asking to contact him and offering as much money as necessary for the job. Sometime later, the scene cuts again while it's raining in the city. That elderly woman from earlier, while walking, thinks she should do the laundry. Shortly after, a car pulls up beside her and a group of people gets out, asking if the woman's name was Sukja. Saying they were from the returnees department, they ask if they could meet with Park. Hearing what the girl said, the woman remains silent. Then once again, the scene cuts to Junho's car. In the middle of that rain, he mentions that he couldn't see anything, wondering what the protagonist could be doing. At that moment, the dogs seem to be on high alert. Within seconds, a goblin appears. However, it is easily defeated by someone, and Park shows up. Shortly after, the two step out of the car. More monsters begin to appear. Park then hands a dagger to his brother, asking him to follow while he kills them. Desperate, the boy asks him to wait a moment. Park, for his part, asks why Junho was hesitating. Junho then questions if it was really necessary for him to awaken. Park responds that he couldn't survive if he remained weak, which is why he had to kill them quickly. Soon after, another goblin appears, rushing straight toward the dog. Park then tells the dog to bite the goblin. The leaps at the goblin, starting to bite the monster's arm. However, it still wasn't enough. Park says that it's because the dog is too young, so if the goblin isn't weakened, the dog will likely die. Thus, Junho should go help him, ordering his brother to kill the goblin. However, Junho still seemed reluctant to do it. Meanwhile, the dog was on the verge of being devoured, but Junho suddenly changes his mind and rushes at the monster. He manages to stab it, saving the dog's life, but it still wasn't enough, and Park tells him to continue. Junho then begins a series of attacks again. Everything was done, and his hand was covered in ketchup-like blood, completely desperate at what he was witnessing. Park tells him to pick up the knife again, but Junho replies that he really couldn't do it. Park responds that if he didn't kill, he would likely die. Once again, the dogs seem to be on high alert. Another goblin appears. Park once again tells him to follow while he kills the monsters because they were running out of time. Desperate, the boy has a flashback from before when he was being bullied by those people. At that time, Park had simply ignored his brother, leaving him alone in that situation. However, now things had changed, and Park was doing everything he could to help him. Seeing all of this, Junho's facial expression changes. He seems to accept everything with open arms. He then picks up the dagger again, saying it was true because he had always been like this. He then charges at the monster, easily attacking it, telling it to shut up and just die. He then splits its face in half, starting a series of attacks while the monster was on the ground. Shortly after, everything was done, and the ketchup-like blood was running in the rain. Junho, for his part, seemed to have changed a lot because now, instead of being afraid, he had a terrifying look in his eyes. At that moment, another goblin appears. However, Junho notices it, managing to block the monster's attack. Both of them fall to the ground, but Junho still manages to finish off the monster. He quickly gets up, thinking that the feeling he was having was very good. Meanwhile, Park was standing on top of a building watching his brother. Surprised that the name Junho had been given was Butcher, mentioning that his brother was evolving and that it was really cute. Park then asks if his brother had worked part-time at a slaughterhouse. With a threatening look, Junho replies no. Park then calls for his brother, who, with a threatening gaze, begins to approach the protagonist. On top of the building where Park was, several monster bodies were lined up. The boy says he was going to take a rest there. The scene then cuts to the awakened association. Junho, alongside his brother, was completely covered in ketchup-like blood. The other woman, surprised, wonders what had happened. Park, for his part, replies that he had just awakened. The woman then asks him to take a bath at least and be re-examined to check for any kind of disease. Afterward, he could go to the dimensional energy measurement room on the 3rd floor. As they climb the stairs, Junho asks what the woman had said about the meter. Park responds that it was a machine that measures dimensional energy, and the number needs to be higher than 100 to be registered as an F-rank awakened. He mentions that he got a 96, which is why he failed. However, Junho didn't understand why he had passed, as it didn't make any sense. Inside the room, the doctor asks Junho to lie down on the machine. Looking up, he notices some kind of energy orb above. Then the number 111 appears as his rating. The doctor says he can get up, asking him to proceed to the ability manifestation room. He then asks if Park would also be doing it. Shortly after, the boy lies down on the machine, and when he looks up, the system alerts that something was observing and recording his information. At that moment, as a reflex, he opens his eyes, where the number 189 appears in front of him, leaving Park shocked by what he saw. The woman mentions that his dimensional energy had grown rapidly, just as the rumors said. Park then asks if the machine was really giving the right data, questioning who had built it. The girl responds that she was sure it was the scientist who had created the machine. Sometime later, the same girl from before says that the results for both Park and Junho had come in, and as a gift, they received a cell phone. Junho was now qualified to register for the mercenary test. As Junho accepts everything, the protagonist congratulates him, asking if he didn't feel anything strange when he was in that machine. However, Junho replies that there was nothing unusual. Park asks if it was because Junho wasn't as sensitive as he was, and asks what his awakened ability was. His brother responds that it was decapitation. Meanwhile, they encounter Choi's group. Seeing the girl, Park walks toward her. The guy next to her says it looked like Park had a death wish, but then they realize it was Park. The protagonist apologizes to Choi for the misunderstanding, explaining that he still wasn't used to talking with civilized people. However, the girl responds that they wouldn't see each other again. Seeing Choi leave, Park falls silent, saying it was a shame as she was the captain, but her personality was quite unpleasant. The scene then cuts to Suho clan's house. Meanwhile, Miso is sitting beside that elderly woman who was drinking, commenting that the wine was very good. The elderly woman says it was great to have a girl with a hearty appetite, and her husband had made that wine 10 years ago but passed away before he could taste it. Miso then mentions that Park was taking a while, but soon after, a boy arrives. Junho's son, excited, notices they had arrived. Miso approaches Park, and the boy asks who she was. Checking her stats, he sees that she was a rank A level 2. Park asks if she was the captain of the returnees department. Questioning why she was there, Miso replies that she came to sign a contract with him, asking if he knew the official name for a returnee. However, Park says no. The girl replies that it was human coordinate. She then asks if, when he returned to Earth, he came through a red portal. She explains that once he returned to Earth through that portal, certain conditions were met. Thus, that portal would appear again, and a bridge portal could go back and forth. Park, hearing this, becomes thoughtful, thinking that this could mean he could find his friends. Miso says that the Awakened Department suspects this planet is the new 4th planet. If her assumption is correct, South Korea would be the only country in the world with a portal to the 4th planet. Park then asks when that portal will form. The girl responds that it would be at least 99 days. So the protagonist asks what she wanted from him. The girl asks him not to appear until the portal is formed. Confused, the boy asks why. Miso replies that she didn't want him to become a second lead dungeon. Not understanding anything, Park asks who the heck that person was. Miso explains that he was currently the number 1 in the world and was originally from Korea. During the early stages of the Great Disaster, the government detained and confined returnees in the name of national protection. However, at the time, they didn't have much information about irregulars. And because of this, Seok-woo, who was a rank D awakened when he returned, easily escaped. Currently, all 9,000 gates in Tokyo are because of him asking if Park knew what the dimensional industry was. If a portal appeared while on vacation, Korea could suffer a great loss. Park then asks what he would get if he did that. The girl responds that it could be anything. The protagonist then asks for a promotion for the Suo Guild and an exclusive territory for it. Meanwhile, Han, on the other side of the room, was listening to everything. Miso asks if he wanted anything else as she was writing everything down. Park asks if she knows when the portals will appear. The girl says that a specialist agent in dimensional energy disruptions would be dispatched, and she was the best agent in the department. Meanwhile, a flashback of the protagonist saying you want to have children with Choi appears. The girl asks if he was joking with her. The other man observing everything asks why she was reacting like that. Choi, irritated, says she should have thrown Park in prison for what he did. Miso then appears, asking what was going on. The girl responds that she was upset, and for that reason, Miso shouldn't bother her. Asking what Miso wanted, the girl responds that she needed her for a mission. Looking over some papers, the girl asks why she was the one assigned to that mission. Miso responds that it was because Choi was the right person for the job, as she was the best in the team when it came to detection. She asks Choi what she thinks will happen if a portal opens in the middle of the city, especially one where they don't know what kind of planet it leads to. Choi responds that it would be like hell on Earth. Miso tells her that if she sees any signs of a dimensional breach, she should grab the protagonist and leave the field immediately, and until then, she shouldn't leave his side, asking if she understood what she was saying. With that, Miso leaves. Choi, irritated, mutters that one day she'll write her resignation letter because of this. The scene then cuts to the protagonist's house. Cherno asks why Park is so happy, and Ham responds that they passed the test to promote their clan. Additionally, starting that day, it would be able to tackle dungeons up to level 2. Park comments that it was very good news. Cherno adds that if they want to enter level 2 dungeons, they would need to be in a rank P group. But at the moment, they still had too few people, asking if it wouldn't be better to focus on level 1 dungeons for now. Ham agrees, saying Cherno wasn't wrong, but as long as Park is with him, he's sure the level 2 dungeons will also be easy. Park says that first, they will make money from level 1 dungeons, then they will level up by acquiring skill books. After that, when they are ready, they will prepare attack teams to recruit more members if necessary. Shortly after, the monk introduces himself. Everyone greets him, asking if he has already eaten. The monk responds yes, and says they would set out that day. The scene then cuts to several cars lined up. The people are heading toward the portal. Looking to the side, another man notices something. He observes the protagonist's group. Then he approaches Park. He greets him, saying it's been a long time, asking where his friends from that time were. But at that moment, the man changes his expression. Park, for his part, seems confused. The boy says his friends are fine, but Park questions why they're in a day group. At that moment, the man's group says they should leave, so the man replies that he has to go. The monk asks Park who that man was. Park replies that he was a dungeon companion, but they should forget about all that and enter the dungeon. Meanwhile, an unknown man observes the protagonist's group heading toward the portal, apparently smiling. Then the other man's group also says they should enter. Meanwhile, the man thinks about how he couldn't tell Park that his clan had disbanded. The two people he called companions had left under the excuse of medical care. It was a common story where a guild collapses when its core members leave, and zero-level clans are easy to form and easy to dissolve. The stress level caused by a work environment where it's kill or be killed reaches a point of no return. Mercenaries without a clan often band together to challenge dungeons in day groups, so there had to be at least one person destined to be his comrade among those people, and for that reason, he would start again. Shortly after, the scene cuts to Shu riding her motorcycle, saying she's heading to the Since the Morning. Misa responds that she will send the location. The scene then cuts to the dungeon where the protagonist is, which is being easily annihilated. Han, excited, says that the skill he learned from the skill book is really good. Meanwhile, Juno is desperately attacking the monsters. At that moment, one appears behind him, but Juno notices it, successfully defeating it. Han, surprised, realizes that Juno smiled after defeating the monster. Meanwhile, Park watches everything from above, saying that it seemed like the three of them were enough. At that moment, a light appears among the trees, and another hunter is seen running desperately from the monsters. At that moment, the man from before appears to help him. However, it doesn't seem to help at all. The man asks why he threw a firebomb at him. Shortly after, the other companion is grabbed by one of the monsters, and as a consequence, he appears to be devoured. That boy lying on the ground mentioned that the team was already nearing its end, thinking that he was really envious of Park's group. But still, he wouldn't give up and would stand up. Han said that this time he was faster and was feeling less tired. The protagonist said that was great, and from now on they would split up and attack in teams. But a man appeared, questioning if they were part of the Suvo clan. The boy, in turn, asked who he was. That stranger introduced himself as Choi Myung-woo and said he was from the B-gi Guild. Everyone was surprised because it was a famous guild ranked 20th in the country. The man said it was a coincidence they were sharing the same area as the Suvo clan, so he just wanted to give them a gift. He had heard the group had leveled up so as they would receive a free entry ticket to a level 2.0 dungeon. Han got excited because an entry ticket to that dungeon was worth around 10 million won. Myung-woo asked what the group thought about going right then, but he was asked if they shouldn't prepare before going to a level 2 dungeon. However, he responded that they didn't need to worry because strategies had already been made and equipment would be given as a gift. Han told the protagonist that with that support, it was already enough. But Suvo in turn said for the rest of the group to go to a level 1 dungeon to improve teamwork, and that he would go to the level 2 one. The man smiled maliciously upon hearing that. Suvo's group decided to obey his orders. Myung-woo then asked the young man to get into his car. While on the way to the location, the man said they would use Portal 47. Suvo commented that he didn't see any mercenaries. The man explained that it was because the portal had formed recently, and that he had already handled the entry procedures so the boy could now enter, and that they would be grateful if the Suvo clan continued using their guild's portal. The protagonist said he liked the portals that were close to him. Upon getting out of the car, the man was informed that everything was ready. A soldier handed over strategy notes for that dungeon and a survival kit. Before entering, the protagonist looked back and said they would grab something to eat when they got out. Myung-woo then waved at him and said to come out quickly so they could have a drink. Right after, the boy activated his helmet and entered the portal. After that, a motorcyclist approached. Upon parking, she took off her helmet and asked if Suvo had entered. The man replied yes, and asked who she was. Chloe ran toward the portal and said she was a member of the Suvo clan and would also enter. The man smiled after hearing that. Myung-woo told a guy that it would cost 2 billion per head, and the guy asked why it was so expensive since it wasn't even murder. The man then replied that it wasn't difficult to manipulate them, but there was a high risk because the boy was very famous. That woman entered the portal. Earlier, she had met with the protagonist's group and asked where he was. Her friends then explained making the girl drive quickly to catch up with the young man. She told Miso that he was heading to a different portal and that she was chasing after them. The woman then told Choi to enter the portal with him because she wanted her to confirm and report his abilities with her own eyes. The girl then said there wasn't much to see in a level 2 dungeon, and she wasn't even dressed appropriately for that. Miso mentioned that she already had the bracelet on. The girl replied that she liked those clothes. The woman said she would give a double bonus for property destruction. Choi asked if it was really necessary to go that far. Miso asked if she didn't think it was important to catch Suho. While driving, the girl said the woman had told her she already had the contract, and in turn, she replied that guarantees were a basic thing. Back in the present, Choi was entering the portal. On the other side, Suho commented that the atmosphere was different there. Right after, he noticed someone was coming through the portal and Choi appeared, asking him to close his eyes because her clothes had disappeared during a trip. But quickly, she put on her bracelet and a new outfit appeared. The girl commented that she should have asked for a triple bonus. Then she realized that the young man had witnessed the whole situation. The woman got upset because she had asked the boy not to look. Nervous, Suho said he liked the bracelet and asked if it had an inventory function. But the girl ignored the question and asked how long he had been watching. Suho remembered that in past situations, she had also seen him without clothes, so now they were even. Then the boy asked why she had come all the way there. Choi responded that she was there to be his guardian. Suho commented that he thought they would send someone competent. Annoyed, the girl said she was the most qualified. The boy in turn said she didn't seem like it. Choi said she had only come that way because she was in a hurry. The protagonist said she could stay, but she wasn't to touch his prey. The girl reassured him, saying she had only come to see how good he was. Then the girl remarked that it seemed like they had already come to receive them. Looking ahead, they came across a large creature. Choi said the boy was lucky to face the dungeon boss right off the bat. Suho, in turn, said there were 4 bosses. After that statement, the girl was confused. Then 3 more things were approaching. The girl said that could be possible because level 2 dungeons weren't like that. The protagonist replied that this wasn't a level 2 dungeon and asked if the girl hadn't noticed when passing through the portal. Choi replied that she hadn't noticed because of the bracelet's barrier. While advancing toward the monsters, Suho told her not to interfere regardless. A massive explosion occurred next. The girl wondered what kind of speed that was. The protagonist headbutted one of the orcs, sending it flying away. After that, the boy grabbed the axe the monster was carrying and chopped off its head. The second orc appeared, but Suho threw the weapon at the creature's head. While fleeing from the third monster, he held onto a vine, making the orc lose sight of him. While it was distracted, the boy advanced over the creature. Outside the dungeon, Mangu was on a call, saying they could already be paid because even if they were S rank, it was impossible to escape. Meanwhile, the boy struck the monster on the head, leaving the girl astonished at what she was seeing. The last orc was approaching. Suho smiled and asked why he should care about the dungeon level when all he had to do was kill them all. The boy dodged the creature's attack and landed a precise kick on it. With a repulsion from the kick, the orc was impaled by a tree branch, earning the boy 32 conquest points. The protagonist said the place was a gold mine. Then he told Choi not to just stand there and help collect the blood crystals. The girl thought that even being an irregular, he barely had the experience points on F rank, but she didn't see even a hint of hesitation in the way he hunted and killed, and then she wondered if he was some kind of psychopath. Then she uttered the word search. While collecting the items, the boy commented that even the blood crystals were big, but Choi said that now wasn't the time to be doing that. Suho, in turn, asked why. The girl explained that even though he had killed 4 orcs, the gate hadn't opened yet, and the only thing in the bag was rocks. The protagonist then said he could at least use them to store blood crystals. Choi said that the dungeon was at least level 4, and it would be hard for them to get out alive even by combining their forces. Then the boy realized that Maimu had lied and had made him enter a level 4 dungeon for free. After that, he shouted, saying he was going to buy something really cool for the man when he got out of there. Choi concluded that the boy was truly an idiot. Right after, a 5th orc charged toward the girl, and she tried to defend herself. But remember that she wasn't carrying her sword because she had left it on her motorcycle. Luckily, Suho managed to save her and said she could relax because he was strong, although he used to be stronger. Then Choi sensed a presence, followed by loud noises. The girl decided to use her clairvoyance and saw several creatures approaching. Choi then said it was an orc squad and that they were surrounded along with a war chief. Suho said that even though the monk mansion wasn't there, the prey kept coming. All the orcs advanced, mounted on wolves, making the protagonist surprised by it, and he told the girl not to touch them because they were all his. Choi activated her shield to protect herself. Meanwhile, the boy continued cutting off the orcs' heads. Then the girl used her inventory to retrieve her sword, using it to cut one of the monsters. But still, she would have preferred to have her blade. Suho appeared, telling her not to touch his prey, and continued cutting off the orcs' heads. However, right after, he was struck by one of the creature's clubs. It was the orc war chief's. But the boy quickly got up and asked if that beast was the chief. Without any response, the creature charged at him, but the boy dodged and stabbed the beast with his knife. Choi asked if he had killed it, but it still wasn't enough to defeat the orc. Miso was asked if Choi had gone after Suho, but the cell signals of both were in different locations with no movement for an hour. The woman said she was sure the two were together, but they stopped the car, handstand to rest for an hour, and reorganized their inventories before going back. Then they noticed that the protagonist had forgotten his phone in the vehicle, and Choi had left hers on the motorcycle. Miso asked them to check the girl's location, and was informed that she was in a newly opened level 5 dungeon. The woman wondered why they were there, and asked was in charge of managing the DGB guild portal to call her immediately. Inside the dungeon, the protagonist was thrown, and the orcs kept advancing. Suho said that now things were getting tough. He quickly stood up and immobilized one of the creatures, grabbing its axes, and threw them at the orcs. Right after, they started shooting arrows, and Choi managed to dodge them, but she ended up tripping. The monsters took advantage of the opening to try to attack the girl, but she used her defensive bomb, blowing up the creatures. Suho saved the girl from being hit by the orc chief, taking her away. Choi asked what he was doing, and the protagonist in turn replied that they needed to run. The girl said there were orcs everywhere, and the protagonist in turn pointed to a place that was empty. Choi said they couldn't go there because it was a cliff, and that's exactly why the boy wanted them to go there. Then Suho carried her in his arms, asking her to hold on tight. After that, they jumped off the cliff. Meanwhile, those monsters were still chasing them. Thus, Park managed to land on the ground, and those monsters all seemed to have been knocked out. Choi, on the other hand, was surprised because she was still alive. Right after, Park left a Jigachad, threw the girl to the ground, saying he had almost died. Choi was still in disbelief at what Park had done, and looking up, she was surprised as they had fallen from such a height, yet they were still alive. Then the scene cut to a cave, and Park, along with the girl, was inside it, asking the boy what his plan was, to which he replied that if he killed just 4 more orc warriors, he could level up, and after that, they would attack again. Choi responded that leveling up increases the limit, and it wasn't as if you get stronger from it, but Park said that for him, it was like removing his restrictions, stating that he got stronger every time he leveled up. Sometime later, the scene cut to 2 ambulances speeding toward a location. Thus, the portal where the protagonist was had been completely surrounded, and a reporter was there, broadcasting the whole thing. Meanwhile, Han, along with his group, was in despair. The news reported that the suspect came and claimed that Park's Suho along with Choi, had entered voluntarily, but after his lies were detected, the guy from the army headquarters confessed to his crimes. Thus, the reporters around asked that guy to say something, questioning what the protagonist's final words were. The man watching everything thought it was very annoying, as he hadn't expected that woman named Choi to be from the department. While the attention was being redirected to the safe return, Park was presumed to be a returnee from a fourth planet. Right after, the scene cut to Miso, asking what the director was doing since he needed to go after those people. However, the director responded that the person who had done that had already been caught, and the head of Driving Loan had fled, but they had placed a bounty on his head. Miso said that was just cutting the tail of the operation, as it was a level 5 dungeon, asking if he really thought that was done by just one person. The director asked if she wanted them to investigate a level 5 guild just because of that, and if Park and Choi would come back to life if they did. However, Miso responded that it was already enough to warrant an investigation. The man replied that Park was supposedly just a returnee from a fourth planet, and therefore he might only be a returnee from a dungeon, not a new planet. The reporter continuing to speak said that recently, the number of crimes connected to criminal organizations had increased, and because of that, there had been criticism of the urgent need to punish the dungeon management by the guilds. The director said they were now spreading the press release around to pressure the guild, so if they could go there, it might improve everything. With tears on her face, the woman said that she was the one who had sent Choi to that place. The director asked if she thought he felt nothing about the situation, but at that moment, there was nothing he could do. Still, those words weren't enough, and the girl remained deeply guilty about it. The scene then cut back to the dungeon where Park was. An orc was walking there and was suddenly surprised to encounter an unknown creature. Immediately, it tried to grab it, but the creature dodged and started running towards it. It tried to launch a series of attacks, but nothing worked. In seconds, someone appeared above the orc who was quickly finished off by this person, and the system notified that they had gained 32 conquest points. Park pleased, and he now only needed 3 more points to level up. Meanwhile, Choi was using her clairvoyance ability and found another orc, mentioning it was approximately 100 meters ahead. In seconds, the protagonist leaped and quickly appeared behind that monster. However, the creature noticed the boy, and the girl tried to warn him that it was a trap, but it was too late because Park had already fallen into it and collapsed to the ground, apparently injured. Right after, the orc seemed to signal something, and as a result, several monsters appeared, surrounding the girl who quickly approached the protagonist, urging him to get up. Soon after, the boy woke up, realizing they were surrounded by many monsters. He was very surprised because he had indeed fallen into a trap, wondering why it was happening this way, and his senses were becoming blurry, unable to muster any strength in his body. But still, he couldn't give up, as he had been through much worse than that. Then, the girl threw some bombs at the monster, which resulted in eliminating many of them. Taking advantage of the opportunity, the protagonist got up and grabbed his dagger, managing to finish off a few more, thinking he just needed one more monster to finish and level up. However, shortly after, he was fatally struck by another monster. Meanwhile, Cho was lying down, observing everything, mentioning that the orc was really fat. Right after, Park was thrown towards another monster, and as a result, both of them fell, and Park's axe was knocked from his hand, where it ended up falling onto the monster's head. The system notified that 1075 conquest points had been accumulated, asking if he wanted to unlock the beast transformation ability. Park, watching this, remained silent, and meanwhile, the giant orc was heading towards Cho, who said she didn't even have the strength to stand. The scene then cut to the protagonist's clan house, where an old lady called the dog to go eat, mentioning that it had been 2 days since they'd had any news of the two. Once again, the scene cut back to Cho's battle against that orc, right after Park activated his beast transformation and returned to his home. The dog seemed a little different, as a kind of energy sphere was surrounding its entire body. In disbelief, the old lady asked what that was. Then the scene cut back to the protagonist. A kind of black aura was surrounding his body, apparently changing his form. He had even grown some claws, completely changing his human appearance. Right after, Cho was hit by that monster, seemingly drained of all strength to fight. However, the protagonist, now in wolf form, appeared before the orc. He quickly grabbed his head. Cho, in turn, was surprised, wondering if by any chance that was a werewolf. At that moment, Park, in wolf form, began unleashing a series of attacks on the monster. He even bit its neck, and the system notified him that he had gained 45 conquest points. Thus, the battle seemed to be over. Cho, still surprised, was watching the protagonist, asking if he was really Park Suo. Then the boy just barked a few times, apparently confirming that it was true. Surprised, the girl asked if he was a dog or a wolf. Once again, the scene cut to the reporters, stating that it had been the third day since those people had gone missing. There had been no news of them since they entered the dungeon. A reporter then asked the director to tell the viewers what dungeon it was. The director replied that it was a level 5 dungeon known as Orc Castle. It was a dungeon where it was recommended to take at least a group of 30 members of rank B or higher. The scene then shifted back to the dog, which was still surrounded by that kind of energy sphere. The old lady was still in disbelief, wondering what kind of thing that was. At the same time, the scene cut to Choi, who was apparently surprised. Park had indeed returned to his human form, saying that he could fuse with the beast he had tamed. Looking to the side, Choi noticed the girl, questioning what she was doing. They should collect as much loot as they could to roast and eat later. However, she responded that it was all useless because that place would be their grave. But Park still didn't understand what she was talking about. The girl then replied that even with the Orc war chief dead, the door still hadn't opened. She asked what he thought that meant, and said they could probably be trapped there forever. Park then asked if she was saying that it wasn't the chief. Choi replied yes, mentioning that there was a stronger monster there. Park asked what kind of monster could make Choi think she would die before even seeing it. Then the girl began to tell the story from 3 years ago. At that time, when they had just risen to rank B, the department had sent a team of 20 fighters with 10 rank A mercenaries on a mission in the level 5 dungeon. Then a flashback appeared, and an unknown man was looking at Choi, asking if her ankles were okay. The girl replied not to worry about that, saying she was much better now. Right after, the scene cut to several orcs advancing towards the group. The man told them to maintain the formation as they advanced to the central tower. Thus, the others began eliminating the orcs in front of them. The man kept giving orders so they could continue advancing, but at that moment, he was killed. Right after, Choi fell to the ground, and the orcs began heading toward her as she was paralyzed, unable to move out of fear. However, that other guy appeared to save her, successfully eliminating the orcs around her. Miso then, in the middle of the battle, told them to clear the path, defeating the monsters nearby, saying that Choi, along with that man, should retreat. Right after, that guy took the girl's hand, saying they should leave quickly. However, Choi replied that they should wait, mentioning that something was wrong. But the guy said they could talk about it after they got out of that place. So they began running from the monsters. However, there was still something strange as there was energy coming from the other side. Meanwhile, a terrified monster was on top of that tower, and at that moment, an arm seemed to be dislocated. Thus, Choi fell to the ground, and a katana also appeared in front of her. Mitsu, along with the group, seemed surprised by something as the captain had been killed. That monstrous goblin stood before him with tears in its eyes. Choi was watching all of this, and that man, with his last words, mentioned the sword. However, Choi wondered who should care about that stupid sword. She remembered the teachings of that man, who said she should put her feelings into her sword, as it was her body and mine as if they were one. Because of that, she should grip the sword as if it were everything. Returning to the flashback, that man had apparently been finished off. Choi, traumatized, was watching everything. Right after, it is seen cut to the present where Park in the rain was observing the girl who seemed shaken by something. At that moment, Park approached her and ended up hugging her, saying that something had happened to her. Then the scene shifted to Han, desperate, wondering what they should do if he left them. Meanwhile, something very crazy was happening. The reporter said that a great shaman was performing a ritual to save the protagonist's life. In addition, an attack force made up of the highest ranks from the Sioux district was gathering in front of the dungeon for a revenge mission. Meanwhile, that man was very nervous, saying that if he had joined the Sioux guild from the beginning, this wouldn't have happened. Right after, the scene cut to an unknown man watching that news broadcast. At that moment, a girl grabbed him from behind, asking what he was watching. The man said it didn't matter how much time passed. The stupid sentimentality of that country remained the same. The scene then cut to the cave where the protagonist was dining next to the girl, saying that the food was really good. Observing the girl, Park mentioned that she seemed to really enjoy eating. The girl asked if eating 12 hamburgers was really that much. She said she was actually full. Park in turn asked why, mentioning that it was his 22nd. Right after, the girl thanked him for everything. At that moment, a light began to glow around the area. Park asked if she had used that sword to kill the Orc Lord. Koi replied no, but she'd have fainted instantly, and when she regained consciousness, she was in the hospital next to Miso. Miso had taken her master's sword, and 2 more Renka mercenaries had to sacrifice themselves to barely manage to kill that monster. Park then asked if she meant there was an Orc Lord in that place, questioning where it was. Koi responded that it was probably an Orc castle, but there was nothing like that within a 1-kilometer radius. Right after, that spirit from earlier appeared at the cave entrance, and the girl said that usually, warchief monsters were in 4 small towers. An Orc Lord was in the middle of them. Then, that tiny spirit appeared next to Park, seemingly holding some kind of information. The boy replied that she had found Orc Castle, so he stood up, saying they should go at once. Koi asked if he had a plan. The boy replied that they would simply find them and kill them. Choi, surprised, said she wanted to smack him, but she couldn't think of a better plan than that. Right after, the scene cut to Orc Castle, and at that moment, the gates seemed to be opening. From it, several monsters mounted on wolves were marching toward the location. Park then appeared, and the girl was riding on him as they headed toward the castle. The orcs noticed this and blocked their passage. Choi noticed the situation, saying that the orc knights were on their tail, and they needed to move quickly. The monsters began preparing their bows, but the girl used shield magic to defend against the attacks. They leaped toward the bridge, managing to escape the area. Koi threw a bomb, and a massive explosion followed shortly after. They successfully escaped, and the girl told him to head toward the center to distract all the orcs. She looked up and saw several monsters coming their way. The girl was grabbed and began falling toward the ground, but she told him not to worry, saying he should just run. At that moment, she grabbed onto a piece of the castle and managed to recover. However, more orcs appeared in front of her. Quickly, Choi drew her sword, while the protagonist continued climbing toward the top. He reached the location where he found a throne, and a terrifying goblin was waiting for him. Right after, the goblin stood up. Looking down, he was surprised as Park bit his neck and threw him to the ground, easily finishing the boss. The system notified him that he had leveled up, and as a consequence, the castle began to collapse. Amidst all of this, Choi was also falling, assuming she would die there. However, Park appeared, grabbing her hand and managed to save her. Choi asked what had happened to the Orc Lord, and the protagonist replied that he was already dead, so they should leave and find the portal exit. They began running from the monsters. Koi, still in disbelief, asked if he had really killed the Lord that quickly. The boy confirmed and asked her to scan the door. The girl used her ability, and was surprised to see that the dungeon door was indeed open. Still in disbelief, she wondered if the boy had really killed the Lord that fast. The scene cut to a truck where data analysis was being presented. Another guy seemed surprised by something, mentioning that the CT-27 dungeon was opening. Outside the room, the protagonist's group was very surprised. The reporter mentioned that the countdown to the CT-27 dungeon breach had begun. As a result, all the spectators were delighted. Meanwhile, Park and Choi were still running from the monsters. Park asked if the girl had found the door. Choi, happy, replied that yes and said the door was very close, so they should hurry. However, the protagonist sensed a strange smell and changed direction. Choi asked why he did that, mentioning that they were running out of time. Park responded that he wanted something to drink. At that moment, he encountered some wolves and asked them to follow him. The monsters obeyed his orders. Choi, surprised, asked if he was taking those wolves with him. The boy replied yes, mentioning that from that day on, they would be like his family. Right after, they encountered that group of orcs again, and the girl mourned that they were now surrounded. However, Park responded that his friend had told him there was a small exit somewhere else. At that moment, Choi used her ability again and told the boy to turn right. They managed to find the exit. In the midst of it all, Choi warned that there was only 1 minute left before the door closed. Then, the countdown started from 23 seconds. At that moment, an arrow was shot, flying directly toward Choi. Immediately after, the girl was struck by the arrow. She fell to the ground. As a consequence, the orcs began heading towards her. The boy tried to turn back. However, Choi told him not to come. Despite this, Park didn't listen and rushed towards the girl. He managed to defeat one of the orcs in front of him. Meanwhile, outside the dungeon, the reporter announced that it had been 8 seconds since the dungeon door closed. Everyone at the scene was hoping that Park and Choi would return. Back inside the portal, Park was relentlessly fighting to get out of that place. As he picked up the girl, she mentioned that there were only 4 seconds left. The protagonist then asked her to hold on tight. He made a giant leap. Outside the dungeon, the countdown had already reached 0. However, a beam of light appeared, and the dungeon seemed to have been completely destroyed. Outside the dungeon, the reporter said that everyone had been filled with hope, but unfortunately, Park and Choi had not returned. However, they were surprised, because several wolves began emerging from that place. And then the protagonist, along with Choi, appeared. The people around said that they had seen someone flying out. For that reason, they hurried to verify it. Recognizing the figure, they realized it was a human. It was Park, along with Choi, still alive. The reporter, in the midst of all that, announced that a miracle had happened and that the 2 people trapped in the dungeon had returned alive after 4 days. Miso, observing the footage, commented that the image was taken right after they exited the portal and that they were immediately taken to the hospital afterward. Thus, various headlines about the event began to appear. The director, watching in awe, remarked that the reporters were being very provocative with their headlines. Miso said that it was because someone had given them the tip, so they were. Then the man said they were there to figure out how to resolve the situation, not to accuse others, so they should continue the meeting. Miso continued, mentioning that news about Park had spread. Thanks to the incident, scouts from agencies in various countries were already heading toward the boy. One of them was named Victor, an agent of Russia's KGB. Another was Gorenstein from Israel. Lastly, there was Nakamura, the vice chief of Tokyo's Awakened Federation. Irritated, the director asked if that idiot Nakamura had come again. The girl replied yes, and in addition, he had taken Sungwoo. But she still thought America was even more dangerous. The director said they needed to secure Park first of all, asking if there were any security measures beyond the contract they currently had. Then the doctor said that as long as Park's family remained in Korea, he wouldn't leave the country. Surprised, the director asked if the boy cared more about his family than about money. The doctor replied that Park had lived among wolves for over 1,000 years, so he was probably missing his family a lot. However, it was the opposite, as he began to miss the wolves he had lived with for 1,000 years after returning to Earth. The director commented that the protagonist was a very difficult person to understand, and the doctor said he valued spending time with his family more. For that reason, in a way, he was just a normal person. Thus, they should offer him a territory where he could live with his family without any problems, and as a result, Park would have no reason to go against the department. The director agreed to that plan, but said they still needed to prevent the scouts from signing a contract with him. Miso then showed an image on the television saying it was an abandoned factory, so it would be better to give that area to the Suo Guild as their territory and mark the surrounding land as private property. The director said that those buildings could be fine after some repairs and asked if Chuo would continue keeping an eye on Park. Miso replied that she was the most suitable person for that job. Then the director asked if she had already woken up, and Miso said she was already recovering. The director inquired if she was resting after writing a report about Park, and the girl replied that he was like a dogman. This left everyone surprised by what they had heard. The director asked her to continue speaking. Soon after, the scene shifted to an arena, and the announcer was greeting all the fans worldwide. It was the largest competition to determine the strongest, and finally, the moment for the final match had arrived. The crowd went wild, and then the silhouette of an unknown man appeared. The announcer began to introduce this person, mentioning that he was the current rank No, one defending his title for the 21st time, remaining undefeated in his 45 previous battles, the strongest creature in the planet's history, and the hope of people living in these desperate times. His name was Okita Hiro. Next, that man's sword seemed to be emanating a dark aura. Meanwhile, a woman was watching from above. Soon after, Hiro jumped, landing in the arena. The next participant was about to be introduced, the S-rank human weapon and the rising star of the generation, undefeated in his 13 battles. His name was Michael. That man also jumped into the arena, quickly rushing toward Hiro, claiming that his era would end now. He threw a punch toward the boy, who managed to dodge. However, Michael hadn't given up and kept attacking Hiro. But soon after, the boy began to counterattack, successfully landing a series of blows on Michael. As a result, Michael's armor cracked. However, he pulled out a kind of sword from his hand, but Hiro dodged it, managing to strike Michael again. Still, it wasn't enough, because Michael had already chained Hiro, feeling pleased that he had finally caught the boy. Immediately after, he began attacking Hiro again. At that moment, Hiro calmly informed Michael that he was already dead. Out of nowhere, blood began to pour from Michael's mouth, leaving the entire audience in shock at what they were witnessing. Because within seconds, Michael was already on the ground. The announcer, surprised, asked what had happened, mentioning that Michael had been on an incredible winning streak, yet he was defeated so easily. As a result, the medics rushed to try and heal him, but still, the man wasn't moving. And as the announcer was saying, the referee had already given his verdict. Michael was unable to continue the fight. Thus, Hiro defended his title for the 22nd time. Right after, Hiro left the arena. Another man asked Hiro if he had used something new, and Hiro replied that he had just thrown the aura from his sword at the man and then let it flow naturally. He added that everyone had done a great job and that they should go out for drinks afterward. Soon after, he opened the door, and at that moment, the girl from before embraced him, asking if by any chance he had killed that man. Hiro responded that considering Michael was destined to become one of the 7 future villains, he probably should have done it. The girl replied that he shouldn't try to handle everything on his own. Hiro then asked if anything unusual had happened. The girl said she had received a call from the department, but aside from that, Nothing significant. She mentioned that the director had told her to be careful not to get hurt, so they should get ready and leave as everyone was waiting. The scene then shifted to that man from earlier, watching the battle on TV. The girl said that some time ago, she heard that the person trapped in the level 5 dungeon had successfully escaped, leaving the man very surprised by what he had heard. The girl said people were calling him the second Samu of Korea, and they seemed to have high expectations for him. Furthermore, there were reports that the Defense Department was very interested in him. Hiro then asked who that person was. The girl replied that his name seemed to be Park, asking if Hiro remembered the guy the reporters had mentioned, who was trapped in a level 5 dungeon. She then showed Hiro some information about Park on her phone. Hiro replied that he had never seen him before, wondering if perhaps he hadn't awakened as a swordsman, since it had been a year since one had appeared. The girl replied that from what she had heard, he was a druid, and if he had indeed returned from a 4th planet, there was a chance Earth could connect with it. And even as an F rank, it was still incredible. Soon after, Hiro gave a smile, thinking that such a thing was impossible. He mentioned that this was his 25th regression. He had repeated the same event over and over for around 500 years, and as a result, he remembered all the awakened individuals who would make their names in the future, as well as having a general outline of the major events. However, Park wasn't on that list, and throughout that entire period, no one named Park Soo had ever stood out, much less a returnee from a 4th planet, and the story changed very little depending on his actions. And all of that was what happened after 5 years. A new planet would never appear in that timeline. Then the woman asked if it wouldn't be a good idea to bring the protagonist to their side. However, Hiro replied that he wasn't sure how to answer that. The woman mentioned that he was the most popular person in Korea, but Hiro suggested they wait a bit longer, because soon the apocalypse would begin, and the cities, which were the fortresses of the survivors of the cataclysm, would be destroyed one by one due to the many dungeon breaks on the continent, along with waves of monsters emerging from them. As a consequence, monsters ended up dominating the skies. Amid the death on the continent, a mass exodus began. During the Long War, everything was forgotten, while the heroes who emerged among the awakened Asians and the homeless chose their last hopes. That's why Hiro decided to build his base in Japan, even though he was called a traitor for it. And if he dealt with the dungeons in that country, along with the talented people who showed their true abilities, that country would become the best place for survivors to live. Moreover, the Korean survivors didn't call him a traitor. They just called him by his name, and they always referred to him as a hero. Returning to the present, Hiro said he thought it was all just a spectacle. Furthermore, it could be a complete fraud, and if Park survived after the apocalypse began, it would be too late to bring him to their side. So they should wait and observe a bit longer. Then the scene shifted to the hospital. Miso entered the room where Troy was. She asked if it hurt. The girl replied that it did. Right after, Miso sat on her bed, saying that she didn't seem to be in pain. However, Troy insisted that she was. Miso mentioned a rumor going around the hospital that a masked guy came every night and left at dawn, asking if it was Park. Meanwhile, the girl seemed to be reading an ebook. She asked if Miso had bought what she wanted. Miso said she was lucky because she had sent one to her and also brought food. Sometime later, Troy had finished her meal. Miso told her that she should go back to work, asking why she was still lying down. The girl then replied that she would sleep for just 1 hour, but Miso responded that she wouldn't let her do that. Right after, the scene cut to the CIA headquarters. Some people were watching the news about Hiro. One man commented that it didn't matter who it was still Michael, and to think he was defeated so easily. Another man said Hiro seemed to keep getting stronger. At this rate, an SSS rank could appear soon. He wondered where Park and Suho might have gone. But it wasn't that they could have gone somewhere, because these were photos taken recently by their agents. The man was confused. He asked if that was at Seoul Station, wondering what the boy was doing in that place. The other man responded that Park had been visiting that place quite often recently. He joked that maybe Park was talking to pigeons or something like that, mentioning that it seemed like he had been rejected by someone. He added that he could introduce him to many beautiful women because they couldn't let anyone steal their protagonist, no matter what happened. The man then said that his special agents would leave Korea that morning, leaving the man very surprised by what he had heard. Then the man commented that the airways didn't seem too clear at the moment. The man asked what was wrong with them. The scene then cut to a jet. Several people were inside. Meanwhile, a girl seemed to be looking out the window. She mentioned that there was a very pretty bird flying outside, so her mother also looked. However, she was shocked by something. A giant monster was flying overhead. It was revealed that the dragon was much smaller than they had initially thought. But still, it was a reason for everyone around to be surprised. The people in the plane were also shocked. They speculated that the monster was following them, wondering if it was a wyvern. However, the other man responded that it was young, so nothing was likely to happen. He questioned why a monster like that was in that area, speculating that a dungeon might have appeared nearby. He was stunned by this revelation, because at that moment, a giant wyvern started flying over the plain. Shortly after, it began preparing an attack, engulfing the plane in flames. As a consequence, the plane exploded, plummeting toward the ground in free fall, and the dragon continued flying in the air, eventually joining several of its companions. The scene then cut to 2 cars. Han remarked that the country seemed to have gone crazy, mentioning that they were almost there. Juno asked if that was the place they were heading to. Han, surprised by what he was seeing, asked if that was a haunted house by any chance. In front of them stood a very strange house. As Han approached it, he remarked that it indeed looked like a haunted house. He started to argue, questioning if that was really going to be their guild's headquarters. He asked if the guy who was supposed to install the internet would actually come to such a place. Then, Choi mentioned that she had just seen a ghost on the 2nd floor. A discussion erupted among the group about whether to enter the house. Koi said she couldn't live in a place like that. Miso told her it'd be quiet, saying that she was probably a bit shocked since it was her first time in a place like that. She mentioned that the renovation would start the next day, so there was no need to worry. Park Vin asked what the problem was, stating that he really liked the place and that they could move in right away. Choi approached the protagonist and asked if he was crazy. Miso remarked that a man with wild instincts would act impulsively, wondering if they should mark the boundaries of the land. That way, they could decide how much land to take over. Park seemed to ponder the suggestion. At that moment, he appeared to use a kind of ability. A light began to envelop the area, leaving everyone surprised as the tree spirits seemed to be appearing. The spirits appeared to be heading toward a specific location. Miso asked what he was doing, and Choi mentioned that he was marking the boundaries of the land. The spirits seemed to be doing something, and suddenly, sprouts of trees began to grow, which quickly turned into a massive forest. Everyone was amazed by the speed at which the trees were growing. A forest had appeared in the middle of that area. Park then announced that he had finished, stating that the perimeter was likely about 1 kilometer from the house at the center, so they should mark the land up to that point. With a smile, Miso said that it looked great, declaring that from that day on, the area would be designated as the Shugal Guild's territory. Thus, everything within the territory would belong to the guild. Park asked if they weren't being too generous, considering he only needed to stay in the country for a few months. Miso responded that they were just following protocol. Besides, her department viewed Park as part of their family. Park, in turn, said he liked that. Shortly after, Miso asked him to sign the contract. However, Choi intervened, telling him to read it carefully, but Miso insisted that he should just sign it. Afterward, it seemed like everything had been settled. They all agreed to do their best until the portal opened. Park, for his part, said he would keep his promise. Miso then asked him to trust the government. They drove off in the car. Choi demanded that the renovation team be sent to the site, or she would leave. The car soon drove away. Miso, irritated, commented that the girl was becoming more and more of a problem. Another man asked if such a large territory could be maintained by so few people. Miso replied that if they couldn't, she would use that as an excuse to send her personnel there. For that reason, she asked for a list of attack units above level 5 and to have them ready. The scene then shifted to an unknown ship. Several bandits seemed to be trying to board it, mentioning that they had hit the jackpot. So, they started shooting at the ship. The group inside the ship seemed very desperate, immediately calling for help. They began sending several SOS messages to nearby people. At that moment, the bandits started boarding the ship. One of the men told them to start the engine and hide in the engine room. However, it didn't seem to be enough. Everyone was soon shocked by something. In a matter of seconds, all the men on the ship were thrown into the air. Right after, a tentacle appeared, and a gigantic creature seemed to be trying to swallow the ship. As a consequence, the ship began to sink. The other man, who appeared to be the captain, fell into the water. At that moment, a giant monster appeared right in front of him, swallowing him whole. It was then revealed that several sharks with unusual forms were lurking in the waters. Meanwhile, a helicopter flew over the area, reporting that they had reached the coordinates sent by the boat. After searching a 16 kilometers area, there was no sign of the ship. Meanwhile, the giant tentacle remained below the surface, soon heading toward another ship. The scene then cut back to the protagonist's clan house. The tree spirit seemed to be doing something with the surrounding trees, and the house itself appeared to be undergoing renovations. Shortly after, Troy's phone started ringing, but she was still asleep. She eventually answered the call. Miso, on the other end, said it seemed like she was having a lot of fun in that house. Troy, still groggy, asked why she would say that, mentioning that she was still on duty. Miso asked if she was with Park at that moment. The girl, still half asleep, said she didn't know. Irritated, Miso called her lazy, asking what she meant by not knowing. Troy was told to get up, so she got up and saw a giant tree in front of her. As she sipped her coffee, she remarked that Park had really planted a lot in a short amount of time. All the trees had already grown. She admired the stunning massive tree that stood before the house, with several wolves roaming the area. Meanwhile, various system screens were appearing in front of Park, showing information about the wolves. The protagonist then began renaming all the wolves. The system mourned that if dimensional energy exceeded his own, he could lose his sanity during fusion. Park, looking at the information, wondered if he could keep leveling up the wolves. Right after, Troy appeared, asking what he was doing. Park replied that he was assigning names to the members of his family. Troy remarked that he should have woken her up, asking why he had gone off alone. At that moment, the dog from earlier appeared. Surprised, Troy noted how quickly it was growing. Park mentioned that everyone had gone out in the morning and were probably heading toward the dungeons. Koi, surprised, commented on how hard they were working, even in such hot weather. Park then asked if she wanted to take a walk to cool off. At that moment, the boy transformed, asking her to hop on. The girl complied, asking if he just wanted to show off what he had done. However, Park told her to just hold on tight. He started running at great speed, leaving Troy amazed at what she was witnessing, asking him to slow down. Meanwhile, the pack of wolves was heading toward the protagonist. The scene then shifted to another location. A man asked if there was really nothing to report, mentioning that headquarters had requested any updates. But it had been 2 months since they last left the house. He asked if anyone had crossed the boundary. The other man pointed to the cameras, saying that the military would be dispatched immediately if anyone did, and since no one knew when the portal would open, 2 units would be stationed nearby. At that moment, a car appeared. The man noted that it was the Suva clan's vehicle. Shortly after, the truck left the area, heading toward a specific destination. Inside the truck, Shuno mentioned how hot it was, but the reporters still wouldn't drop the situation. Meanwhile, Han was browsing YouTube, looking at information about the protagonist, wondering what he was seeing. Shuno asked what he was looking at. Han replied that it was nothing, though he seemed up in thought. He wondered why so many countries were sending foreign donations to Park. Moreover, the highest donations appeared to come from very influential foreign scouts. Looking to the side, they spotted the protagonist and Troy, with the wolves following alongside them. Troy waved at them, and Han called her sister-in-law, which irritated her. Han remarked that if Troy lived and aided the protagonist's house, she was probably his sister-in-law, adding that Park didn't seem willing to give them a ride. Watching the two, he commented on how fast Park was, prompting Shuno to step on the gas, insisting they wouldn't lose to a car. Thus, it seemed like they were having a race to see who was really faster. Looking back, Troy noticed something, asking if the boy had sensed it too. As Troy observed, she confirmed that they were witnessing a dimensional break within a 200-meter radius. A flashback of the protagonist and Troy in the hospital appeared. The girl asked what kind of planet he had been on. The boy responded that he had been in the animal kingdom, an unimaginable place full of hostile creatures with dimensional energy greater than 700. Troy was completely shocked by what she heard, as that power was immense. Park continued, explaining that it was a place where territorial and survival battles never ended until one was dead. To be the leader of a group, one had to be at least rank U. Even after becoming a king, he had to accept challenges for hundreds of years. The scene then shifted back to the present. Koi thought that with the bridge portal connected to the planet, unrestricted passage was possible for both sides. If what the protagonist said was true, that place would become a war zone where they would have to fight against hostile beings from another world, likely battling beasts with dimensional energy above rank S. The scene then cut to Troy talking with the director. She asked if he thought Park's planet would be friendly toward them. The director in turn questioned why she was worried, mentioning that Park was the king of that place. The scene shifted again to Park and Troy. Troy questioned why the boy had said he was king of that place. Park replied that if the current king wasn't the same as before, they would want to kill him if they saw how weak he was now. Troy, bewildered, asked why that made so much sense. She then told him to run at full speed toward the northeastern field, because they needed to get as far away from the city center as possible. They began moving toward some bushes. Han, meanwhile, wondered where they were heading, deciding to follow them quickly. As they proceeded in the same direction, a beam of light started to appear. Troy mentioned that the portal was beginning to open as the space around them started to distort, leaving her puzzled by what she was seeing. Soon after, Miso received a call. Troy informed her that the portal was about to form. Miso, confused, asked for clarification. Troy requested that the portal's location be sent to the guard units. A short time later, several convoys arrived, preparing their missiles for a possible attack. The protagonists seemed to notice something, mentioning that this wasn't the planet he had been on, but just a normal portal. Troy asked how he could be sure without even using any equipment. At that moment, the boy stopped, saying the sensation was different from when he had crossed. Troy explained that the portal he had crossed was a teleportation portal, which returnees sometimes used. That's why it might feel different. However, Troy realized something. thinking that now that she had stopped to reflect, the dimensional energy of a teleportation portal Park had crossed was greater than that of a bridge portal. At the time, she had thought the device was broken, and she suspected that something was off with her intuition. However, it was true that her instincts were telling her this was something very dangerous, like before. But in any case, this was still a dungeon portal, yet she was still questioning whether it was really a portal at all. The other soldiers, watching everything, speculated that it might be a dimensional break. Soon after, several cars arrived at a specific location. The other man mentioned that this was the department's detection team. At the same moment, several helicopters appeared over the area. The man was shocked, saying that a portal had indeed opened, suspecting it could be a dimensional break. At that moment, another beam of light engulfed the area, and as a result, a new portal emerged. Troy, for her part, confirmed that it was indeed a dungeon portal, thinking that Park had much better intuition than hers, even though she had the best detection ability in the country. Soon after, the protagonist brother's car was spotted. Hans and the processor approached. Hans, approaching, announced that it was a portal, speculating that it might be a new planet. At the same moment, 2 more cars appeared, and a group of soldiers emerged, mentioning that they were the 11th detection team. For that reason, they began installing measurement devices in the area. Juno asked what those devices were for. The girl explained that the device was used to calculate the dungeon level and the time until it would break. They started analyzing some data, and the number 4280 appeared. The other man informed them that it was just a level 4 dungeon. Park remarked that it would do. Miso, apparently disappointed, asked if it was really a level 4 dungeon. Shortly after, the girl changed her clothes, saying that Park had mentioned the portal wasn't the one he had gone through, so she thought it was necessary to enter and check out the place. A scene then shifted to the director on a call, asking if it was really a level 4 dungeon. Miso replied that they weren't certain yet. They first needed to determine if the newly created dungeon was connected to where the protagonist had come from. The director, sounding exasperated, mentioned that this was driving him crazy. He asked if Miso knew how much money they had wasted on this. Miso repeated that they weren't sure yet, since Park's skill level was incredibly high. The director added that if the first portal appeared near someone who had just returned, it was likely a dungeon portal. He questioned if Miso knew who had trusted and invested in this project. Miso responded that Park had great value simply for being an irregular. An argument ensued between them. The director finally asked them to find a way to resolve the situation, stating that if they didn't recover the investment, they'd be ruined. Back where the protagonist was, all the analysis had been presented. One of the men stated that the dungeon would break in 50 days, so they should send the Park remarked that this would work for him. Another man mentioned that Park would need to complete the level 4 dungeon. Park asked if that would be difficult given the current number of guild members. The man said it would be easy. He then explained that the dungeon energy measurement device was a piece of equipment most guilds had, but the latest model cost around 3 billion. Park commented that it was very expensive. However, the man informed him that they were notified to rent the device permanently for this portal. He asked Park to sign some papers for that reason. The protagonist, observing the situation, asked why they were giving him so many gifts. The man simply smiled, telling him that even if he wasn't a returnee from a new planet, the department would never treat him poorly. He mentioned that foreign countries had recently been trying to recruit him. For that reason, he should know that the department viewed him as family. As the country's treasurer, they told him to relay this message. However, Park looked confused, saying that he hadn't received any messages from any foreign countries. Just then, Han appeared, asking if he could have a word with the protagonist. He explained that at that moment, competition for Park was fierce abroad, and since Park didn't use the internet much, Han had received a lot of donations. Park asked how much it was. Han said it was around 5 billion. The protagonist placed a hand on Han's shoulder, telling him that no matter how much he liked money, he shouldn't become a slave to it. He said that while living life, he would realize that having someone to talk to is far better than that amount of money. Han seemingly sat and said he would keep Park's words in mind. He explained that the foreign countries wanted Park to at least see what they were offering. Han said he had to show him 3 offers. Park asked what Han had done. Han replied that the countries hadn't sent assassins just because he didn't show them the offers. Park told him to just say that he showed the offers but was ignored. He then asked Han to grab Chuno and change clothes for their return. Han said he would take some of the donations and send the rest to the guild's treasury. The protagonist told him to do as he pleased. Han, thinking that Park was very generous and exactly his type, was pleased to have just gained over 3 billion. Time seemed to pass. Park asked if everyone was ready because they were about to enter the dungeon. At that moment, the other man appeared again, telling them to wait because a combat team from the department was on its way. However, the protagonist declined their assistance, saying that if they needed to mobilize someone to inspect the contract, he would only allow up to 2 people. However, they wouldn't be able to participate in the hunt. Troy reassured him not to worry as they were ready to enter. The other man mentioned that the leader of the team should know that a level 4 dungeon wasn't easy to handle with just this many people. However, Cho told him to be quiet and focus on recording everything. Soon after, the dog from before appeared, and Park said it should come along to level up. They all entered the portal, immediately finding themselves in an unfamiliar place. Park mentioned he wasn't entirely sure of the location. Cho then began using her ability to scan the surroundings. Park remarked that the place seemed somewhat familiar. The other man asked why they were walking so casually when they should be more cautious. Han replied that since the protagonist was leading, all they had to do was follow. Suddenly, Cho asked everyone to stop, reporting that there was a group of 3 monsters 70 meters ahead. Han quickly drew his weapon. The other man questioned if that would be enough, and Han confidently said it was. With a determined look, Juno drew his sword. Surprised, the other man questioned why Juno was acting that way. Juno rushed toward the monsters, but Park swiftly knocked him out, seemingly rendering him unconscious. Park asked Han to help wake him up. The other man asked why Park was acting like that, and Cho explained that Juno had a condition that made him go insane whenever he held his blade. Meanwhile, Han was still trying to wake Juno. Park, however, seemed to notice something, as something unknown appeared in the bushes. Park immediately instructed everyone to move back. At that moment, a monster emerged and began heading toward the group. Everyone quickly assumed their defensive positions, but Park charged forward instead, moving directly toward the monsters. The other man recorded everything. Several monsters rushed at Park, but he effortlessly dispatched them all. The system notified him that he had earned 48 conquest points. Everyone remained on high alert, as more monsters could be nearby. Park was surprised at the speed of his reaction, wondering if this was real. Park then reminded Juno not to forget about the loot. The two of them began harvesting the stones from inside the monsters. The other man commented that Juno seemed normal outside the dungeon, but once he held a knife, he became a psychopath. Cho told him to stop talking and focus on moving forward. Park announced that he would start killing the monsters next, so everyone should stay on guard. After collecting the stones from the defeated monsters, the other man, watching everything, wondered if sending C-ranked soldiers and interns to deal with a rookie and a psychopath was wise. Park then called for the dog, asking it to head into the forest and bring more monsters back. The dog followed Park's command and headed into the forest. Meanwhile, Cho and the other man observed everything, wondering what would happen if a horde of monsters came charging toward them. As the team leader questioned if they would be okay, Cho simply told him to keep recording. Soon after, Park announced that the monsters were coming, and a loud rumbling echoed through the area. The other man was panicking about everything that was happening. Han, noticing that Juno was losing control, told him to take a tranquilizer. However, Juno, driven by madness, charged toward the monsters. At that moment, the dog reappeared, and an arrow flew straight at it. Juno managed to dodge the arrow and successfully struck one of the monsters rushing toward them. He quickly advanced, finishing the monster with ease. Immediately after, the other man warned Juno to be careful, as there was a monster right behind him. However, it was already defeated. Han had taken it down from behind. Using his crossbow, Han finished off the monster alongside Juno. Both satisfied with their teamwork, Han reached level 9. The other man, observing this, fell silent, asking if this was really a level 4 dungeon. Cho sarcastically asked if he thought it was a level 3 dungeon, telling him to concentrate on recording and stop talking so much. Suddenly, the dog appeared to be on high alert, and Park noticed this. At that moment, a monster emerged from the bushes, rushing toward the protagonist, who swiftly drew his dagger. The scene shifted to a car amidst a large crowd. The other man seemed to be welcoming the sector director, while Miso asked what he was doing and if he had a death wish, questioning why he hadn't moved out of the way yet. The young man said he would only move if something happened. They mentioned that not long ago, Captain Lee's combat team had entered that area, and if it was a combat team, didn't that mean it was a level 4 dungeon? The recently appeared dungeon was probably one of them. Upon hearing this, Miso remained silent for a moment, then instructed them to move out of the way immediately. As she left, the young man sarcastically thanked her, calling it a waste of time, and noted that it was only a level 4 dungeon returnee. They decided to start gathering their things. Meanwhile, Miso's car continued heading toward the site. One of the men in the car commented that it was probably a confidential operation, and asked what they would do if the information got leaked. Miso questioned what he thought was more important, higher-ups playing with money or the protagonist. The man admitted that the protagonist was likely more important. Miso then said that if they revealed to everyone that Park was a returnee from a dungeon, the news would draw a lot more attention. The man asked if Park would be okay, Miso explained that this was why they were heading to the protagonist, trying to find a solution. Meanwhile, the teams were preparing to enter the portal. The captain asked if they were ready, stating that they were about to take down some monsters. A soldier requested they wait a moment as someone had asked them to hold off. The man asked why they had done that just as a car arrived on the scene. A woman stepped out of the vehicle. Miso greeted the captain. The man asked what she wanted, and Miso responded that he couldn't enter. Confused, the man asked why not. Miso explained that as long as Park hadn't agreed to cooperate with the combat team, crossing the portal wasn't permitted. The man, frustrated, asked what kind of nonsense she was talking about given that the team had to reprogram their plans and rush over in vain. Miso replied that certain things had happened, and for that reason, they couldn't enter the portal. The man argued that there was a flaw in the contract clause, asking if it made sense for only a reconnaissance team without combat experience to go in. Miso responded that they were planning to amend the contract, and she had come to resolve the issue. It also involved something related to the director. Irritated, the man asked why everything had to be so complicated, while Miso suggested they continue the conversation in the car. The scene then cut to the director watching the news on his computer. He muttered that a mistake had been made as he needed to investigate a few more things before releasing a more formal statement. At the same moment, the man received a call, frustrated, asking why he still couldn't reach Miso. The scene transitioned to a building. The doctor from earlier was reviewing the protagonist's information, saying that Park represented a shattered dream on a planet in Korea, and that it was likely a pivotal moment in the story. He reflected that the boy's life was like a drama filled with numerous conflicts. He recalled the protagonist's words about hiding near the coast before discovering fruit on trees, noting that in his past, the sea had provided plenty of food. However, it didn't take long for him to realize that it wasn't a place where he could live, because when he looked to the side, he saw something. A massive monster was circling the area. The doctor, startled, realized that there couldn't be an ocean in a level 4 dungeon and wondered what that meant. He thought about the current theory regarding the origin of dungeons, that a planet could become part of a dungeon. A flashback of the protagonist appeared, mentioning that his brother was coming and asking the doctor to help find him. The doctor had agreed, but on the condition that Park tell him his entire story spanning 500 years. Back in the present, the doctor remarked that the protagonist had promised to share everything after reuniting with his brother. He noted that for an F-rank returnee, Park was a very ordinary person, despite having lived hundreds of years as the king of the jungle. However, the doctor regretted losing the opportunity to hear a much more interesting story due to a hasty decision. Returning to the dungeon, Park was still finishing off those monsters that he coldly watched, eliminating them one by one. The other man, observing this, said it was insane, as he could avoid an ambush like that. Park asked what the problem was, as he should help with the spoils. So, the man started doing what the boy had asked. Sometime later, the group was walking through the dungeon. Kui asked what that place was, as it was strangely beautiful, and Han, in disbelief, said that the shining stone looked like a gem, but it seemed to cast a dark hour. Park said he had never been to a place like that and wondered why something seemed so familiar. Soon after, the group found a different stone, noticing that there was an inscription telling them never to return to that territory. Meanwhile, Park was observing it, and Kui asked if by chance it was one of Han's pranks. With the boy replying that it wasn't, the girl said everything was fine. Kui asked if the guy was recording, and he replied that he was. At that moment, she noticed something as the protagonist was climbing to another place. Thus, the group ended up following him, where they found a different place because there was a cave, and so that place opened up. Han, in disbelief, asked what it was because there were several inscriptions on the walls of that place, being very surprised by what they were seeing. However, those inscriptions were very confusing, as they were completely different from what they expected. Moreover, in that writing, it said it missed humans a lot. Additionally, there were various drawings written on those walls. Soon after, they came across a large phrase saying it missed many people it used to hate, as well as its family and his brother. Han, for his part, was surprised because the name Junho was also in that place. Soon after, they came across the phrase saying that Park Suho had been in that place. At that moment, they realized what was happening. Han said it was similar to prehistoric cave paintings and seemed to have great scientific value. Choi, approaching Park, asked if, by any chance, he had lived in that place, and the boy, with a threatening look, seemed to be observing something. Seeing one of the said it had been 500 years since he became the owner of the Moon Hill, where he remembered one of the opponents he had to face, who was simply a giant black tiger that always gave him that threatening look when they fought. Soon after, Choi asked if the boy was okay, and the protagonist was still observing those writings, remembering every battle and every experience he had in that place. Thus, he seemed to have realized something. Han continued searching the cave and mentioned that there were also some unfinished blades in that place, wondering how they made those blades as the stones were very shiny. At that moment, the boy started running and Han asked where he was going. Choi, for her part, began following the boy again, who quickly seemed to be heading to a different place. At that moment, he ended up at the top of a mountain. Surprised, he wondered what had happened in that place. At that moment, Choi appeared, asking what had happened and if that was where he used to live. Park replied that it was, but something was wrong as there was a snow-covered mountain in that direction and a grove of fruit trees on the other side. Furthermore, the sea was in that direction. Choi, surprised, asked if there really was a sea. Park said that place was called Maelstrom 12, no one should go there. Choi, for her part, wondered if a sea in a level 4 dungeon was really possible. Questioning if it was Park who had written those phrases, the boy then answered yes, and that was the result of his efforts not to forget civilized society, and in the beginning, when he first arrived in that place, he lived in that cave to hide from the other animals. Even after moving to another location, he would return from time to time to write several times in that place. Choi asked if the lizard men had always been in that place, and the boy replied no. Then the girl asked what had happened to his animal companions. Park said that was leopard territory and they weren't weak enough to move because of a few lizard men. Then Choi asked if he could see that mist, mentioning that it was the end of the dungeon and that's why they couldn't go to that place. At that moment, a noise started echoing through the forest, and Choi wondered if, by any chance, it was the lizard men. Using his ability, he confirmed that it was an ambush. Then several lizard men began climbing that place. Meanwhile, Han, still with his group, was climbing above the boy. Choi responded that there were a total of 102 lizard men approaching, wondering why they were all coming at once. And below them, there was also the Lizard King, who, by the way, had an unknown skull on his head. Park, looking at that skull, supposed it was one of the leopards he had faced. He asked her to stay with her group. Then he quickly jumped off the mountain, falling towards those monsters. Choi, for her part, asked what he was doing. Then the scene shifted to that woman from before watching a pigeon. At that moment, a blue energy began to envelop that animal, and Choi seemed surprised as Park suddenly managed to create wings, flying swiftly toward that monster. Thus, the Lizard King threw his spear. However, Park easily dodged it, and in a matter of seconds, he was already in front of that lizard. Soon after, a blue energy began to envelop that dog from before, and Park transformed into his wolf form, managing to attack that lizard. Thus, the two began to fall toward the bushes. Choi was then surprised by what the boy had done. Han soon reached the mountain with his group. Choi, for her part, said everything was fine because the protagonist wasn't dead. Meanwhile, those lizard men were still climbing the mountain. Choi said there were lizard men 30 meters away and approaching, so they should prepare to fight. The other guy then grabbed a giant stone, saying he was ready for the fight. Han, for his part, grabbed his crossbow, telling them to try climbing. Meanwhile, Jun-ho, without any weapon, also grabbed a stone. Soon after, those lizards got closer, and as a result, Han fired his arrow. Returning to the protagonist, he was in an intense fight with that boss, and it quickly seemed like he could finish him off. Thus, he tore off the skull that was on its head, asking the lizard where the leopards were. However, that monster already seemed to be dead. Back at the mountain, Park's group was still fighting those lizard men, and the other guy asked if long-range weapons didn't use more dimensional energy than short-range ones. Han said there was no power limit as it could be ineffective depending on the person's level. Soon after, Choi warned that more lizards were coming. Jun-ho then grabbed his two weapons. Han said Jun-ho had gone crazy again, so they shouldn't let him jump. Soon after, that other guy noticed something as the protagonist, along with that monster, was in the air, surprised by what they were seeing. At that moment, those lizard men were almost reaching the top of the mountain. Thus, Park seemed to have finished off that lizard man. Desperate, that guy asked to seek cover. Then, that lizard boss struck the mountain. The system notified that Park had leveled up, and the wind ability had been unlocked. As a result of the explosion, several monsters fell into free fall. However, the mountain also began to collapse. Choi, for his part, asked everyone to take cover. However, it wasn't enough as everyone began to fall toward the ground, and all those monsters were also falling. Thus, a landslide occurred. However, Choi seemed to have managed to save himself, asking if by chance everyone was okay. Soon after, that other guy from before said he was fine and Han was glad he was still alive. Beside him, Jun-ho also appeared to be awake. Park, returning to his human form, told him to leave because the door had already been opened. Thus, everyone quickly stood up to return to the world. The guy observing this asked what the point of all this was. Back in the real world, that portal was still very strong. Meanwhile, Miso, along with that group of soldiers, was waiting for the protagonist who at that moment emerged from that place. Meanwhile, that soldier silently observed everything as the group had returned intact without any casualties. Observing the protagonist, the guy asked if that was Park because he seemed a bit weak. Soon after, Miso approached the protagonist, trying to greet him. However, the boy transformed into a pigeon and then started flying towards somewhere. The other guy watching this was very surprised, wondering if he had really turned into a pigeon. Then Miso asked if something had happened, and Choi said if she had gone there to negotiate, she should just leave. Miso asked what had happened with the recording, and Choi asked to simply return to the headquarters with Chief Kim. However, the girl responds that she also needed to go with them. Choi, in turn, asks the reason for that, and the girl replies that the mission to observe Park ended at that moment, and for that reason, she was dispatched. Additionally, she had received a mission to assist at the border of the field near the north of Daegu. The other guy says that 4 members of the portal management would remain in that location, as that was the minimum required to take care of the equipment. Chunho, shaking the guy's hand, asks him to relax, as they would take care of them as guests. The guy observing the protagonist's brother is surprised, as in real life, he was completely different. Then the scene cuts to the other guy asking what he meant by going back, questioning if he hadn't said they should cooperate with the protagonist, and Miso replies to just return and talk about his salary. Besides, the director was waiting for him, and for that reason, they should return right away. The man responds that wasn't the issue, asking why Park had refused to meet with them. Thus, a discussion between them ensued, and Han, along with Chunho, were watching all of it. Han says he was just irritated by the way that guy talked, and Chunho asks to just leave. Soon after, the scene cuts to several buses heading somewhere. Next, someone calls Miso and, exalted, asks where she was and if she had told everything to the press. However, the girl replies that everyone was retreating at the moment except for the management team, so she asked them to resolve it later. Moments later, a guy shows some people a recording where an inscription in Korean appears. Then he asks if everyone saw this inscription in Korean. And with this inscription, they discovered Park Suho's diary written on the walls of the cave. In the recording, the guy suddenly jumps and throws the Lizard King away. At that moment, the guy says that, unfortunately, he couldn't record more inside the dungeon, but he managed to while outside of it. Soon after, a guy sees the boy's form and asks if that was a pigeon, to which the presenter says yes, and they believe he confused with tamed animals. And that was the end of the recording. Then a white-haired man says that it was terrifying because the boy dealt with the Lizard King in that way. In turn, the director asks if, since the strength of the Lizard King in a level 4 dungeon is around rank B. However, the presenter responds that it was actually rank A, and that the boy had defeated a rank A monster with ease. Again, the director asks if Park Suho is then above rank S. However, Troy says that his current dimensional energy is rank E, but his normal combat abilities are rank S+ after fusion. It depends on the animal. However, they believe he can at least reach rank SSS. Furthermore, Park Suho has no level up limit in his abilities, unlike other awakened ones. Then the white-haired guy asks if all the regulars are like that, but Troy doesn't know if they all are like that. At that moment, the director asks what his status was like before his return. However, the guy says that if all the people who disappeared during the cataclysm returned like Park Suho, their country would be extremely powerful. However, the presenter responds that going through a portal without equipment means going in empty-handed, so there's almost no chance of others like him. In turn, the director says that either way, even the first round of tests demonstrated that Park Suho is a return from a level 4 dungeon. But Troy replies that they can't be sure of that yet. Then the director says he doesn't want to believe it, but the fact is that it's not a new planet, and what's most important at the moment is the secret of Park Suho's abilities that are inside that dungeon. However, he asks why Park Suho is stopping the scouts, even after signing a contract. Then the white-haired man responds that perhaps he doesn't want to share the secret of his power, but Troy defends him, saying that Park Suho wasn't that kind of person. Then Miso asks if they don't think they should try negotiating a bit more, but the director asks what more he could possibly want. After all, they've already offered more than enough to the boy. At that moment, Miso responds that that's exactly why. Then Troy leaves the place apparently angry and wonders what they meant by the secret to Park Suho's strength. In turn, the guy tells Miso that if she fills her squad 37 with 80 rank C or higher people, he will take responsibility and find Park Suho. And the issues with the minister's investment would also be resolved without problems. Then the director says that even if they only take all the spoils, it already seemed very good. In turn, the guy says they would earn 3 times the usual amount and a 780% bonus. Next, the director asks Miso what they should offer Park Suho to gain unrestricted access to the dungeon. However, Miso asks if they didn't already have plenty of that to spare. In another place, apparently a plantation, a child asks monk Myeongjin if he was going to harvest the tomatoes from the field. However, the monk responds that not only the tomatoes, but also the peppers and potatoes. As they enter the shed, one of the children says they will harvest 100 cherry tomatoes, and the other says they will harvest 200. Another child mentions that Jongyeon had said she would make roasted potatoes and peppers. Then, they are ordered to each take a hoe to harvest the crops. However, while doing this, a man with sinister eyes seems to be watching them from hiding. Then the scene cuts to a soldier saying they had 10 minutes until departure. Additionally, they should report the number of soldiers and conduct the equipment inspection. Thus, the other soldiers say everything was in order and there were no problems with detection. Meanwhile, Choi was using her phone. The girl says there are no issues with Detection Team 11. The soldier says they were about to begin the operation. Thus, they begin to leave inside the tank. The girl still seemed to be using her phone, and the soldiers were talking, saying they had heard that the Daegu border was like hell on earth because of all the dungeon breaches. The other guy then says they doubted that the detection team would be in command of front lines, asking if it was true. Choi replies that it is, which is why they should write a will and send it to their families before they go out of signal range. Then the scene cuts to another house where the protagonist was, and shortly after he receives a call from Choi. However, the boy was sleeping. Meanwhile, Han was on the computer saying the protagonist was sleeping much more than usual, and since it was revealed he was just a returnee from a level 4 dungeon, the donations should have stopped. However, he is surprised by what he saw. At that moment, Junho arrives at the place. Han asks him to knock before entering, and the boy apologizes, wondering if he was doing something illegal, asking if that monk had called at any point. However, the boy responds that he hadn't. Junho says he couldn't reach and wondering if something had happened. Han asks if he had reached divine enlightenment, but either way he was probably having fun or playing with the kids in some way. Observing, Junho asks what was in his hand, and the boy responds that his grandmother said he seemed to be hallucinating due to a vitamin deficiency, so she bought him some supplements. Han asks if he didn't think the protagonist was sleeping too much, and the man replies that he was planning to wake him up. Meanwhile, in Park's room, the boy seemed to have already woken up and was looking at the giant tree in front of him, thinking that he had already suspected he could reunite with his friends when the portal opened. But the land he returned to was only a small piece of that place. Instead of meeting his friends, it was filled with red lizards he had never seen before, so he had no idea where his red wolf family could be. Additionally, his greatest enemy, Kuro, could be somewhere with that other giant gorilla he had fought before, wondering where they could possibly be, and if they had fled to another place in fear of those lizards. However, he changes his mind instantly, asking if it really mattered, because if they were destined to, they would reunite one day. Soon after, Juno enters the room asking if he was awake so they should eat something. Park replies that he was already awake and had slept so much that he didn't realize he was hungry. Thus, the two leave the room and Choi was still trying to call the young man. A while later, the protagonist was already having dinner at the table with the two, asking where that blonde girl had gone. However, they were surprised by what they heard, asking if he didn't know the name of that woman. However, Park asks if her name wasn't Blondie, questioning why they were acting that way. In disbelief, Han says her name was Choi, asking if by chance the two of them weren't seeing each other before. Park, in turn, asks if he was talking about that house there. Then Juno asks if they thought they were going to send her to the field. Park says he didn't know what he was talking about. Juno says she had called because the protagonist didn't answer his phone, and besides, they needed to recruit new members for the guild. Park asks if they really needed to do that. Juno replies that yes, they did, because they needed people to handle the portal meter, and they didn't know when a portal could sprout in her territory. Next, the protagonist asks Han if he happened to know where they could recruit more people. The boy says he might know if he asked an old boxing friend. Park asks if that monk had come back before. Juno replies that he hadn't called either, and hadn't said where the elderly orphans were living in Seoul. Irritated, Han says that Monk was still not answering his phone, and he wasn't someone who did that. The scene then cuts to the battlefield, and meanwhile, Choi was still waiting for her orders. Looking at her phone, she realizes she was in the red zone with the necrophiles, wondering if that was on the original route. However, she forgets everything and ends up turning off her phone. Then the scene cuts back to Park realizing he had 2 missed calls from that girl. Soon after, he tries to call her. However, that number was already unavailable. The scene then cuts again to those tanks heading to a certain location, and around them were several zombies surrounding that place. Meanwhile, Park was still trying to make that call, and Choi's phone was apparently covered in blood. Thus, Park realizes she simply wasn't answering. Soon after, a car arrives at the protagonist's residence, and Maisu tells Junho they had just arrived, asking if she could meet with the protagonist. The other man, looking to the side, finds Park, who was sitting in a chair looking at something. Park asks if it was about the inspection. Maisu responds that yes, it was, The protagonist says that it wasn't a new planner, asking why they were so focused on inspecting them. Maisu responds that they wanted to uncover the secret behind his ability in the dungeon. Park says he had already told them many times, as they just needed to train hard for 1,000 years, asking why they didn't believe him. The man then asks him to stop acting that way since they were from the same country, so they should help each other as good compatriots in this time of national crisis. Park then asks what the man was talking about. The guy says that the frequency of level 6 dungeon appearances was increasing, and the time limit for a dungeon break was slowly decreasing. The number of infected people in the field had skyrocketed, putting pressure on society during a massive food and labor shortage, and people with strong abilities like the protagonist were desperately needed. Park asks what he meant by infected people. The man says that after the cataclysmic shift, an unknown virus started spreading among the people living in the field. The infected are called necrophiles, and the red areas in that location are red zones with necrophiles. If that zone expands, land-based transportation will be cut off. Dungeon breaks in the field would become increasingly difficult. Mr. says they believed it was an alien virus that came through a portal, but it spread so quickly that it was hard to the situation with their current manpower. Park asks if, by inspecting dungeons freely and hunting there, they would give 2 gifts in return. Mr. says the first gift would be to raise his guild's level to level 5. This meant he could enter dungeons from level 5 and below, asking if that wasn't exciting. The other gift would be to give him new territory, a region that used to be in the north near the protagonist's territory, asking if he could handle it. Park says that if he's talking about the field, the land was already abandoned, asking if he was requesting to protect the east of Seoul in danger. Mr. says they were abandoned lands, except for a few other cities. Most of the region was practically fields. After the Great Disaster, the people who remained in the field couldn't bear it any longer and began moving to safer areas. However, the big cities with stable security didn't have enough space. Park then asks if he should stay in that place and welcome them. Mr. says that when people gather, they tend to help rebuild the city, developing trade districts in the dungeons and clearing the farmland. If his guild were recognized for its ability to manage the territory, it would likely generate a lot of profit. In the dungeon's commercial district, the modular mobile house should be used in case of dungeon breaks. Park, observing all of this, mentions that it wasn't a bad offer, asking about the current situation in North Korea. The protagonist says they took a major hit to their command system at the beginning of the Great Disaster. The other man says there were coups, and when the system collapsed, they escaped to mainland. The remaining survivors are going from place to place struggling to survive. Since they can't manage the dungeons systematically, breaks are happening everywhere, asking if it wouldn't just be a matter of time before they escape to South Korea. Soon after, the protagonist thinks he wasn't sure if he was mistaken. Then he accepts the offer, saying they should sign the contract. Pleased, Maizu says he made a great decision. Park asks if the condition of staying in the country for 30 days had already been rescinded. The girl responds that it had. Park then says there were 2 things he'd like to personally request. First, he wanted to meet the scientist who invented the dimensional energy measuring device. Second, he wanted to locate a member of his guild, the monk from before, because he had stopped answering his phone all of a sudden. Maisu says those 2 requests would be easy to fulfill, so they would take care of it. Standing up, the man says he would begin his mission. Soon after, the scene cuts to a building where 3 people were sitting beside a chair, apparently waiting for something. The other guy thinks that the Estila Guild was the mercenary group created by the largest conglomerate in Korea. Recruitment only opens twice a year, but most mercenaries are disqualified during the initiation phase. That guild was the dream of most mercenaries, which is why it was so hard to get into. But when you make it, you receive immense support. For this reason, he applied, hoping to get something even after being rejected by the guild. However, something unexpected happened, and he passed the registration phase. Therefore, he was being recognized after working for 3 years in small clans and as an influential mercenary. However, it wasn't over yet. Of the 50 people who passed the registration phase, only 10 would be chosen after the interview, so he couldn't lose his confidence there. After all, it could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. At that moment, that boy receives an email from someone, surprised by what he was seeing. Sometime later, a woman says they can now leave the room. As a result, the other group begins to leave. That man says that the open recruitment this time had been very poor, so the candidates were quite ordinary. The other woman says they would be good as porters, as they would treat their supplies as if they were their lives. The other man says he found a swordsman. That man had plenty of experience. His name was Zhang, and he had worked for 3 years but was still in rank E. The guy says if his awakened ability is fencing, it could be worth training him, so he would take that man. Thus, the other man tells him to let the next group in. That guy then calls for numbers 46 to 50 and to the room. The interview apparently began again. The other man asks why there were only 4 people there and where Jang could have gone. The boy replies that Jang suddenly left for some reason. The scene then cuts to that boy's phone from before, because Park had sent him a message asking if he wanted to join his guild. That's why he had left the interview, supposing he shouldn't think about the offer and just accept it. After all, it was the guy who had saved his life and most talked about figure in all of Korea. Soon after, the scene cuts back to that tank again, heading toward the battlefield. The other soldier says they should stay alert because they didn't know when they might be ambushed. Meanwhile, several frightening monsters were surrounding the area. The soldier says the roads were becoming more dangerous, so they should have stayed on their usual path. The other says there was nothing they could do as they wouldn't arrive on time if they took the normal route. Soon after, that soldier calls his friend over because he had come across something very strange, wondering what it could be. Looking more closely, he realized it was several zombies devouring the body of a monster. With a menacing glare, the zombies were watching the tank. The soldier says to turn them into dust with the rocket launcher. However, the guy says that if they shoot, the necrophiles would become highly agitated. The man says they don't have time, so they should fire. If they manage to get out of that place soon, they would be in the military operations area. Following the captain's orders, the soldier starts preparing the shots. Then the captain orders them to open fire. As a result, the missiles are launched.